Section 35 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Richard Aroksaar, Seattle. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 3. The Great Explorers and Travelers of the 19th Century, by Jules Verne. Second part, Chapter 2, Part 2, French Circumnavigators, 11. On the 6th September, the astrolabe again put to sea, and after an uninteresting stay at New Guinea, in the course of which scarcely any specimens of natural history were obtained, except a few mollusca, and still less exact information regarding the customs, religion, or language of its diversified population, steered for Amboina, which was reached without any accident on the 24th September. The governor, M. Mercus, happened to be on circuit, but his absence was no obstacle to the supply of all the stores needed by the commander. The reception given by the authorities and the society of the place was of a very cordial kind, and everything was done to compensate the French explorers for the hardships undergone in their long and troublesome voyage. From Amboina, d'Urville proceeded to Hobart Town in Tasmania, a place not visited by any French vessel since the time of Baudin, arriving on the 27th December, 1827. 35 years previously, d'Entrecasteaux had met on the shores of this island only a few wretched savages, and 10 years later, Baudin found it quite deserted. The first piece of news that Dumont d'Urville learnt on entering the river Derwent, before even casting anchor at Hobart Town, was that Captain Dillon, an Englishman, had received certain information, when at Tucopia, of the shipwreck of La Pérouse at Vanikoro, and that he had brought away the hilt of a sword which he believed to have belonged to that navigator. On his arrival at Calcutta, Dillon communicated his information to the governor, who, without delay, dispatched him with instructions to rescue such of the shipwrecked crew as might still be alive, and collect whatever relics could be found of the vessels. To d'Urville, this intelligence was of the highest interest, seeing that he had been specially instructed to search for whatever might be calculated to throw any light upon the fate of the unfortunate navigator, and he had, while at Namuoka, obtained proof of the residence for a time of La Pérouse at the Friendly Islands. In the English colony itself, there was some difference of opinion as to the credit which Captain Dillon's story was entitled to receive, but the report which that officer had made to the Governor-General of India quite removed any doubt from the mind of d'Urville. Abandoning, therefore, all further plans with reference to New Zealand, he decided upon proceeding at once in the astrolabe, in the track of Dillon, to Vanikoro, which he then knew only by the name of Malikolo. The following is the statement of the circumstances as made by Dillon. During a stay made by the ship Hunter at the Fiji Islands, 3 persons, a Prussian named Martin Bushart, his wife, and a Lascar called Atrovlia, were received on board, endeavoring to escape from the horrible fate awaiting them, which had already befallen the other European deserters settled in that archipelago, that of being devoured by the savages. This unhappy trio merely begged to be put on shore at the first inhabited island which the Hunter might touch at. Accordingly, they were left on one of the Charlotte Islands, Tucopia, in 12 degrees 15 minutes southern latitude and 169 degrees west longitude. In the month of May, 1836, Dillon, who had been one of the crew of the ship Hunter, paid a visit to the island of Tucopia with a view of ascertaining what had become of the people put on shore in 1813. There he found the Lascar and the Prussian, the former of whom sold him a silver sword hilt. As might have been expected, Dillon was curious to know how the natives of that island had come into possession of such an article. The Prussian then related that on his arrival at Tukopia, he had found many articles of iron, such as bolts, axes, knives, spoons, and other things, which he was told had come from Malikolo, a group of islands situated about 2 days' canoe sail to the east of Tukopia. By further interrogatories, Dion learnt that 2 vessels had been thrown upon the coasts many years previously, one of which had perished entirely with all on board, whilst the crew of the second had constructed out of the wreck of their ship a little boat in which they had put to sea, leaving some of their number at Malikolo. The Lascar said he had seen 2 of these men, who had acquired a well-merited influence through services rendered to the chiefs. Dillon tried in vain to persuade his informant to take him to Malikolo, but was more successful with the Prussian, who took him within sight of the island, called Research by d'Entrecasteaux, on which, however, Dillon was unable to land on account of the dead calm and his want of provisions. On hearing his account on his arrival at Pondicherry, the governor entrusted him with the command of a boat specially constructed for exploring purposes. This was in 1827. Dillon now touched at Tukopia, where he obtained interpreters and a pilot, and thence went to Malikolo, where he learned from the natives that the strangers had stayed there 5 months to build their vessel, and that they had been looked upon as supernatural visitors, an idea not a little confirmed by their singular behavior. They had been seen, for instance, to talk to the moon and stars through a long stick. Their noses were immense, and some of them always remained standing, holding bars of iron in their hands. Such was the impression left on the minds of the natives by the astronomical observations, cocked hats, and sentinels of the French. Dillon obtained from the natives a good many relics of the expedition, and he also saw at the bottom of the sea, on the coral reef on which the vessel had struck, some bronze cannons, a bell, and all kinds of rubbish, which he reverently collected and carried to Paris, arriving there in 1828, and receiving from the king a pension of 4,000 francs as a reward for his exertions. All doubt was dispelled when the Comte de Lesseps, who had landed at Kamchatka from La Pérouse's party, identified the cannons, and the carved stern of the Boussole, and the armorial bearings of Collignon, the botanist, were made out on a silver candlestick. All these interesting and curious facts, however, D'Urville did not know until later. At present he had only heard Dillon's first report. By chance, or perhaps because he was afraid of being forestalled, the captain had not laid down the position of Vanikoro or the route he followed on the way from Tukopia, which island D'Urville supposed to belong to the Banks or Santa Cruz group, each as little known as the other. Before following D'Urville, however, we must pause with him for a while at Hobart Town, which he looked upon even then as a place of remarkable importance. Quote, "Its houses," unquote, he says, quote, "are very spacious, consisting only of 1 story and the ground floor, though their cleanness and regularity give them a very pleasant appearance. Walking in the streets, which are unpaved, though some have curbstones, is very tiring, and the dust always rising in clouds is very trying to the eyes. The government house is pleasantly situated on the shores of the bay, and will be greatly improved in a few years if the young trees planted about it thrive. Native timber is quite unsuitable for ornamental purposes." End quote. On the 5th January, the Astrolabe once more put to sea, surveyed Norfolk Island on the 20th, Matthew Volcano 6 days later, Eronan on the 28th, and the Little Mitre Island on the 8th February, arriving the next day off Tukopia, a small island 3 or 4 miles in circumference, with one rather pointed peak covered with vegetation. The eastern side of Tukopia is apparently inaccessible from the violence of the breakers continually dashing onto its beach. The eagerness of all was now great, and was becoming unbounded, when 3 boats, one containing a European, were seen approaching. This European turned out to be the Prussian calling himself Buschart, who had lately gone with Dillon to Malicolo, where the latter remained a whole month, and where he really obtained the relics of the expedition, as D'Urville had heard at Hobart Town. Not a single Frenchman now remained on the island. The last had died the previous year. Buschart at first consented, but declined at the last moment to go with D'Urville or to remain on the astrolabe. Vanikoro is surrounded by reefs, through which, not without danger, the astrolabe found a passage, casting anchor in the same place as Dillon had done, namely in Osili Bay. The scene of the shipwreck was on the other side of the bay. It was not easy to get information from the natives, who were avaricious, untrustworthy, insolent, and deceitful. An old man, however, was finally induced to confess that the whites who had landed on the beach at Villines had been received with a shower of arrows, and that a fight ensued in which a good many natives had fallen. As for the maras, sailors, they had all been killed, and their skulls buried at Villines. The rest of the bones had been used to tip the arrows of the natives. A canoe was now sent to the village of Nama, and after considerable hesitation, the natives were induced by a promise of some red cloth to take the Frenchmen to the scene of the shipwreck about a mile off, near Payon and opposite Ambi, where amongst the breakers, at the bottom of a sort of shelving beach, anchors, cannons, and cannonballs, and many other things were made out, leaving no doubt as to the facts in the minds of the officers of the astrolabe. It was evident to all that the vessel had endeavored to get inside the reefs by a kind of pass, and that she had run aground and been unable to get off. The crew may then have saved themselves at Payon, and according to the account of some natives, they built a little boat there, whilst the other vessel, which had struck on the reef further out, had been lost with all on board. Chief Moembe had heard it said that the inhabitants of Vanon had approached the vessel to pillage it, but had been driven back by the whites, losing 20 men and 3 chiefs. The savages in their turn had massacred all the French who landed, except 2, who lived on the island for the space of 3 months. Another chief, Valiko by name, said that one of the boats had struck outside the reef opposite Tanema after a very windy night, and that nearly all its crew had perished before they could land. Many of the sailors of the second vessel had got to land, and built at Payon a little boat out of the pieces of the large ship wrecked. During their stay at Payon, quarrels arose, and 2 sailors with 5 natives of Vanon and 1 from Tanema were killed. At the end of 5 months, the Frenchmen left the island. Lastly, a third old man told how some 30 sailors belonging to the first vessel had joined the crew of the second, and that they had all left at the end of 6 or 7 months. All these facts, which had, so to speak, to be extracted by force, varied in details. The last, however, seemed most nearly to approach the truth. Amongst the objects picked up by the astrolabe were an anchor weighing about 1,800 pounds, a cast-iron cannon, a bronze swivel, a copper blunderbuss, some pig lead, and several other considerably damaged articles of little interest. These relics, with those collected by Dillon, are now in the Naval Museum at the Louvre. D'Urville did not leave Vanikoro without erecting a monument to the memory of his unfortunate fellow countrymen. This humble memorial was placed in a mangrove grove off the reef itself. It consists of a quadrangular prism made of coral slabs 6 feet high, surmounted by a pyramid of koudi wood of the same height, bearing on a little plate of lead the following inscription. As soon as this task was accomplished, D'Urville prepared to set sail again, as it was time he did, for the damp resulting from the torrents of rain had engendered serious fevers, prostrating no less than 25 of the party. The commander would have to make haste if he wished to keep a crew fit to execute the arduous maneuvers necessary to the exit of the vessel from a narrow pass strewn with rocks. The last day passed by the astrolabe at Vanikoro would have shown the truth to D'Urville, had he needed any enlightening as to the true disposition of the natives. The following is his account of the last incidents of this dangerous halt. Quote, "At 8 o'clock, I was a good deal surprised to see half a dozen canoes approaching from Tavaille, the more so that 2 or 3 natives from Manevai who were on board showed no uneasiness, although they had told me a few days before that the people of Tavaille were their mortal enemies. I expressed my surprise to the Manevaians, who merely said, with an evident air of equivocation, that they had made their peace with the Tevaillans, who were only bringing some coconuts. I soon saw, however, that the newcomers were carrying nothing but bows and arrows in first-rate condition. 2 or 3 of them climbed on board, and in a determined manner came up to the main watch to look down into the orlop deck to find out how many men were disabled, whilst a malignant joy lit up their diabolical features. At this moment, some of the crew told me that 2 or 3 of the Manevai men on board had done the same thing during the last 3 or 4 days, and Monsieur Grecien, who had been watching their movements since the morning, thought he had seen the warriors of the 2 tribes meet on the beach and have a long conference together. Such behavior gave proof of the most treacherous intentions, and I felt the danger to be imminent. I at once ordered the natives to leave the vessel and return to the canoes, but they had the audacity to look at me with a proud and threatening expression, as if to defy me to put my order into execution. I merely had the armory, generally kept jealously closed, opened, and with a severe look I pointed to it with one hand, whilst with the other I motioned the savages to the canoes. The sudden apparition of 20 shining muskets, the powers of which they understood, made them tremble, and relieved us of their ominous presence." End quote. Before leaving the scene of this melancholy story, we will glean a few details from D'Urville's account of it. The Vanikoro, Malikolo, or as Dillon calls it, the La Perouse group, consists of 2 islands, Research and Tavaille. The former is no less than 30 miles in circumference, whilst the latter is only 9 miles around. Both are lofty, clothed with impenetrable forests, almost to the beach, and surrounded by a barrier of reefs 36 miles in circumference, with here and there a narrow strait between them. The inhabitants, who are lazy, slovenly, stupid, fierce, cowardly, and avaricious, do not exceed 12 or 1,500 in number. It was unfortunate for La Perouse to be shipwrecked amongst such people, when he would have received a reception so different on any other island of Polynesia. The women are naturally ugly, and the hard work they have to do, with their general mode of life, render their appearance yet more displeasing. The men are rather less ill-favored, though they are stunted and lean, and covered with ulcers and leprosy scars. Arrows and bows are their only weapons, and according to themselves, the former, with their very fine bone tips, soldered on with extremely tenacious gum, inflict mortal wounds. They therefore value them greatly, and the visitors had great trouble to obtain any. On the 17th March, the astrolabe at length issued from amongst the terrible reefs encircling Vanikoro. D'Urville had intended to survey Tamnaco, Kennedy, Nitendi, and the Solomon Islands, where he hoped to meet the traces of the survivors from the shipwreck of the Boussole and the astrolabe. But the melancholy condition of the crew, pulled down as they were by fever, and the illness of most of the officers, with the absence of any safe anchorage in this part of Oceania, decided him to make for Guam, where he thought a little rest might possibly be obtained. This was a very grave dereliction from the instructions which ordered him to survey Torres Straits, but the fact of 40 sailors being hors de combat and on the sick list will suffice to prove how foolish it would have been to make so perilous an attempt. Not until the 26th April was Hogolay Archipelago sighted, where d'Urville bridged over the gaps left by Duperrey in his exploration, and only in the 2nd May did the coasts of Guam come in sight. Anchor was cast at Umata, where a supply of fresh water was easily found, and the climate much milder than at Agagna. On the 29th May, however, when the expedition set sail again, the men were not by any means all restored to health, which d'Urville attributed to the excesses in the way of eating indulged in by the sick, and the impossibility of getting them to keep to a suitable diet. The good Medinilla, of whom Freycinet had such reason to speak favorably, was still governor of Guam. He did not, this time, it is true, show so many kind attentions to the present expedition, but that was because a terrible drought had just devastated the colony, and a rumor had got afloat that the illness the crew of the astrolabe was suffering from was contagious. Umata, too, was a good distance from Agagna, so that d'Urville could not visit the governor in his own home. Medinilla, however, sent the expedition fresh provisions and fruits in such quantities as to prove he had lost none of his old generosity. After leaving Guam, d'Urville surveyed, under sail, the Levi, the Uluti of Lutke, Guapcolo, and the Pelu group of the Caroline archipelago, was driven by contrary winds past Waigeo, Ayu, Asia, and Quebec, and finally entered Buron Straits and cast anchor off Amboyne, where he was cordially received by the Dutch authorities, and obtained news from France to the effect that the Minister of Marine had taken no notice of all the work, fatigue, and perils of the expedition, for not one officer had received advancement. The receipt of this news caused considerable disappointment and discouragement, which the commander at once tried to remove. From Amboyne, the astrolabe steered via Banca Strait for Uanado, with its well-armed and equipped fort, forming a pleasant residence. Governor Mercus obtained for d'Urville's natural history collections some fine barberosas, a sapiotong, the latter a little animal of the size of a calf, with the same kind of muzzle, paws, and turned-back horns, serpents, birds, fishes, and plants. According to d'Urville, the people of the Celebes resemble in externals the Polynesians rather than the Malays. They reminded him of the natives of Otaheite, Tonga Tabou, and New Zealand, much more than of the Papuans of Dare Harbor, the Harfours of Buron, or the Malays, with their square bony faces. Near Manado are some mines of auriferous quartz, of which the commander was able to obtain a specimen, and in the interior is the lake of Manado, said to be of immense depth, and which is the source of the torrent of the same name that dashes in the form of a magnificent waterfall over a basalt rock 80 feet high, barring its progress to the sea. d'Urville, accompanied by the governor and the naturalists of the expedition, explored this beautiful lake, shut in by volcanic mountains, with here and there a few fumaroles still issuing from them, and ascertained the depth of the water to be no more than 12 or 13 fathoms, so that in the event of its ever drying up, its basin would form a perfectly level plain. On the 4th August, anchor was weighed at Manado, where the sufferers from fever and dysentery had not got much better, and on the 29th of the same month, the expedition arrived at Batavia, where it only remained 3 days. The rest of the voyage of the astrolabe was in well-known waters. Mauritius was reached in due course, and there d'Urville met Commander de Gorant, who had made a trip to Vanikoro in the corvette La Bayonnaise, and who told d'Urville that he had not attempted to enter the reef, but had only sent in some boats to reconnoiter. The natives had respected the monument to the memory of La Pérouse, and had been reluctant even to allow the sailors of the Bayonnaise to nail a copper plate upon it. On the 18th November, the corvette left Mauritius, and after touching at the Cape, St. Helena, and Ascension arrived on the 25th March, 1829, at Marseille, exactly 35 months after her departure from that port. To hydrographical science, if to nothing else, the results of the expedition were remarkable, and no less than 45 new charts were produced by the indefatigable Messrs. Grecian and Paris. Nothing will better bring before us the richness of harvest of natural history specimens than the following quotation from Cuvier's report. Quote, they, parentheses, the species brought home by Quoy and Guinard, end parentheses, amount to thousands in the catalogues, and no better proof can be given of the activity of our naturalists than the fact that the directors of the Jardin du Roi do not know where to store the results of the expedition, especially those now under notice. They have had to be stowed away on the ground floor, almost in the cellars, and the very warehouses are now so crowded, no other word would do as well, that we have had to divide them by partitions to make more stowage. End quote. The geological collections were no less numerous. 187 species, or varieties of rock, attest the zeal of Messrs. Quoy and Guimard, while Monsieur Lesson, Jr., collected 1,500 or 1,600 plants. Captain Jacquinot made a number of astronomical observations. Monsieur Lotin studied magnetism, and the commander, without neglecting his duties as a sailor and leader of the expedition, made experiments on submarine temperature and meteorology, and collected an immense mass of information on philology and ethnography. We cannot better conclude our account of this expedition than with the following quotation from Dumont d'Urville's memoirs, given in his biography by Didot. Quote, this adventurous expedition surpassed all previous ones, alike in the number and gravity of the dangers incurred and the extent of the results of every kind obtained. An iron will prevented me from ever yielding to any obstacle. My mind, once made up to die or to succeed, I was free from any hesitation or uncertainty. 20 times I saw the astrolabe on the eve of destruction, without once losing hope of her salvation. 1,000 times did I risk the very lives of my companions in order to achieve the object of my instructions, and I can assert that for 2 consecutive years we daily incurred more real perils than we should have done in the longest ordinary voyage. My brave and honorable officers were not blind to the dangers to which I daily exposed them, but they kept silence and nobly fulfilled their duty. End quote. From this admirable harmony of purpose and devotion resulted a mass of discoveries and observations in every branch of human knowledge, of all of which an exact account was given by Rossel, Cuvier, Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, Desfontaines, and others, all competent and disinterested judges. End of section 35. Recording by Richard Aroksaar, Seattle.
Section 36 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 3, The Great Explorers and Travelers of the 19th Century, by Jules Verne. Second Part, Chapter 3, Part 1, Polar Expeditions 1. Bellinghausen, yet another Russian explorer. Discovery of the islands of Traversay, Peter I and Alexander I. The whaler Weddell. The southern Orkneys. New Shetland. The people of Tierra del Fuego. John Biscoe and the districts of Enderby and Graham. Charles Wilkes and the Antarctic continent. Captain Bellany. Dumont d'Urville's expedition in the Astrolabe and the Zélé. Coupe Vent de Bois and the Peak of Teneriffe. The Straits of Magellan. A new post office shut in by ice. Louis Philippe's Land. Across Oceania. Adelie and Clery Lands. New Guinea and Torres Strait. Return to France. James Clark Rossett. Victoria. We have already had occasion to speak of the Antarctic regions, and the explorations made there in the 17th and at the end of the 18th century by various navigators, nearly all Frenchmen, amongst whom we must specially note La Roche, discoverer of New Georgia in 1675, Bouvet, Kerguelen, MaryAnn, and Crozet. The name of Antarctic was given to all the islands scattered about the ocean which are called after navigators, as well as those of Prince Edward, the Sandwich Group, New Georgia, etc. It was in these latitudes that William Smith, commander of the brig William, trading between Montevideo and Valparaiso, discovered, in 1818, the southern Shetland Islands, arid and barren districts covered with snow, on which, however, collected vast herds of seals, animals of which the skins are used as furs, and which had not before been met with in the southern seas. The news of this discovery led to a rush of whaling vessels to the new hunting grounds, and between 1821 and 1822 the number of seals captured in this archipelago is estimated at 32,000, whilst the quantity of sea elephant oil obtained during the same time may be put down at 940 tons. As males and females were indiscriminately slaughtered, however, the new fields were soon exhausted. The survey of the 12 principal islands, and of the innumerable and all but barren rocks, making up this archipelago, occupied but a short time. 2 years later Botwell discovered the southern Orkneys, and then Palmer and other whalemen sighted, or thought they sighted, districts to which they gave the names of Palmer and Trinity. More important discoveries were, however, to be made in these Hyperborean regions, and the hypothesis of Dalrymple, Buffon, and other scholars of the 18th century, as to the existence of a southern continent, forming, so to speak, a counterpoise to the North Pole, was to be unexpectedly confirmed by the work of these intrepid explorers. The navy of Russia had now for some years been rapidly gaining in importance, and had played no insignificant part in scientific research. We have related the interesting voyages of most Russian circumnavigators, but we have still to speak of Bellinghausen's voyage around the world, which occupies a prominent place in the history of the exploration of the Antarctic seas. The Vostok, Captain Bellinghausen, and the Mirny, commanded by Lieutenant Lazarev, left Kronstadt on the 3rd July, 1819, en route for the Antarctic Ocean. On the 15th December, southern Georgia was sighted, and 7 days later an island was discovered in the southeast, to which the name of Traversay was given, and the position of which was fixed at 52 degrees 15 minutes south latitude, and 27 degrees 21 minutes west longitude, reckoning from the Paris meridian. Continuing their easterly course in south latitude 60 degrees for 400 miles as far as west longitude 187 degrees, the explorers then bore south to south latitude 70 degrees, where their further progress was arrested by a barrier of ice. Bellinghausen, nothing daunted, tried to cut his way eastwards into the heart of the polar circle, but at 44 degrees east longitude he was compelled to turn northwards. After a voyage of 40 miles, a large country hove in sight, which a whaler was to discover 12 years later when the ice had broken up. Back again in south latitude 62 degrees, Bellinghausen once more steered eastwards without encountering any obstacles, and on the 5th March, 1820, he made for Port Jackson to repair his vessels. The whole summer was given up by the Russian navigator to a cruise about Oceania, when he discovered no less than 17 new islands, and on the 31st October he left Port Jackson on a new expedition. The first places sighted on this trip were the Macquarie Islands. Then cutting across the 60th parallel, south latitude, in east longitude 160 degrees, The explorers bore east between south latitude 64 degrees and 68 degrees, as far as west longitude 95 degrees. On the 9th January, Bellinghausen reached 70 degrees south latitude, and the next day discovered, in south latitude 69 degrees 30 minutes, west longitude 92 degrees 20 minutes, an island, to which he gave the name of Peter I, the most southerly land hitherto visited. Then 15 degrees further east, and in all but the same latitude, he sighted some more land, which he called Alexander I's Land. Scarcely 200 miles distant from Graham's Land, it appeared likely to be connected with it, for the sea between the two districts was constantly discolored, and many other facts pointed to the same conclusion. From Alexander I's Land, the two vessels, bearing due north and passing Graham's Land, made for New Georgia, arriving there in February. Thence they returned to Kronstadt, the port of which they entered in July 1821, exactly 2 years after they left it, having lost only 3 men out of a crew of 200. We would gladly have given further details of this interesting expedition, but we have not been able to obtain a sight of the original document published in Russian at St. Petersburg, and we have had to be content with the résumé brought out in one of the journals of the Geographical Society in 1839. At the same period, a master of the Royal Navy, James Weddell by name, was appointed by an Edinburgh firm to the command of an expedition, to obtain sealskins in the southern seas, where 2 years were to be spent. This expedition consisted of the brig Jane, 160 tons, Captain Weddell, and the cutter Beaufort, 65 tons, Matthew Brisbane commander. The two vessels left England on the 17th September, 1822, touched at Bonavista, one of the Cape Verde Islands, and cast anchor in the following December in the port of St. Helena, on the eastern coast of Patagonia, where some valuable observations were taken on the position of that town. Weddell put to sea again on the 27th December, and steering in a southeasterly direction, came in sight, on the 12th January, of an archipelago to which he gave the name of the Southern Orkneys. These islands are situated in south latitude 60 degrees 45 minutes, and west longitude 45 degrees. According to the navigator, this little group presents an even more forbidding appearance than New Shetland. On every side rise the sharp points of rocks bare of vegetation, round which surge the restless waves, and against which dash enormous floating icebergs, with a noise like thunder. Vessels are in perpetual danger in these latitudes, and the 11 days passed under sail by Weddell in surveying minutely the islands, islets, and rocks of this archipelago, were a time of ceaseless exertion for the crew, who were throughout in constant danger of their lives. Specimens of the principal strata of these islands were collected, and on the return home put into the hands of Professor Jameson of Edinburgh, who identified them as belonging to primary and volcanic rocks. Weddell now made for the south, crossed the Antarctic Circle in west longitude 30 degrees, and soon came in sight of numerous ice islands. Beyond south latitude 70 degrees, these floes decreased in number, and finally disappeared. The weather moderated, innumerable flocks of birds hovered above the ships, whilst large schools of whales played in its wake. This strange and unexpected change in the temperature surprised every one, especially as it became more marked as the South Pole was more nearly approached. Everything pointed to the existence of a continent not far off. Nothing was, however, discovered. On the 12th February the vessels were in south latitude 74 degrees 15 minutes, and west longitude 34 degrees 16 minutes 45 seconds. I would willingly, says Weddell, have explored the southwest quarter, but taking into consideration the lateness of the season, and that we had to pass homeward through 1,000 miles of sea strewed with ice islands, with long nights, and probably attended with fogs, I could not determine otherwise than to take advantage of this favourable wind for returning. Having seen no sign of land in this direction, and a strong southerly wind blowing at the time, Weddell retraced his course as far as south latitude 58 degrees, and steered in an easterly direction to within 100 miles of the Sandwich Islands. On the 7th February he once more doubled the southern cape, sailed by a sheet of ice 50 miles wide, and on the 20th February reached south latitude 74 degrees 15 minutes. From the top of the masts nothing was to be seen but an open sea with a few floating ice islands. Unexpected results had ensued from these trips in a southerly direction. Weddell had penetrated 240 miles nearer the pole than any of his predecessors, including Cook. He gave the name of George IV. To that part of the Antarctic Ocean which he had explored. Strange and significant was the fact that the ice had decreased in quantity as the South Pole was approached, whilst fogs and storms were incessant, and the atmosphere was always heavily charged with moisture, and the temperature of surprising mildness. Another valuable observation made was that the vibrations of the compass were as slow in these southern latitudes as Parry had noted them to be in the Arctic regions. Weddell's two vessels, separated in a storm, met again in New Georgia after a perilous voyage of 1,200 miles amongst the ice. New Georgia, discovered by La Roche in 1675 and visited in 1756 by the Lion, was really little known until after Captain Cook's exploration of it, but his account of the number of seals and walruses frequenting it had led to being much favoured by whalers, chiefly English and American, who took the skins of their victims to China and sold them at a guinea or 30 shillings each. The island, says Weddell, speaking of South Georgia, is about 96 miles long, and its mean breadth about 10. It is so indented with bays that in several places, where they are on opposite sides, they are so deep as to make the distance from one side to the other very small. The tops of the mountains are lofty, and perpetually covered with snow, but in the valleys, during the summer season, vegetation is rather abundant. Almost the only natural production of the soil is a strong-bladed grass, the length of which is in general about 2 feet. It grows in tufts on mounds 3 or 4 feet from the ground. No land quadrupeds are found here. Birds and amphibious animals are the only inhabitants. Here congregate numerous flocks of penguins, which stalk about on the beach, head in air. To quote an early navigator, Sir John Nasborough, they look like children in white aprons. Numerous albatrosses are also met with here, some of them measuring 17 feet from tip to tip of their wings. When these birds are stripped of their plumage, their weight is reduced 1/2. Weddell also visited New Shetland, and ascertained that Bridgeman Island, in that group, is an active volcano. He could not land, as all the harbours were blocked up with ice, and he was obliged to make for Tierra del Fuego. During a stay of 2 months here, Weddell collected some valuable information on the advantages of this coast to navigators, and obtained some accurate data as to the character of the inhabitants. In the interior of Tierra del Fuego rose a few mountains, always covered with snow, the loftiest of which were not more than 3,000 feet high. Weddell was unable to identify the volcano noticed by other travellers, including Basil Hall in 1822, but he picked up a good deal of lava which had probably come from it. There was, moreover, no doubt of its existence, for the explorer under notice had seen on his previous voyage signs of a volcanic eruption in the extreme redness of the sky above Tierra del Fuego. Hitherto there had been a good deal of divergence in the opinion of explorers as to the temperature of Tierra del Fuego. Weddell attributes this to the different seasons of their visits, and the variability of the winds. When he was there, and the wind was in the south, the thermometer was never more than 2 or 3 degrees above zero, whereas when the wind came from the north, it was as hot as July in England. According to Weddell, dogs and otters are the only quadrupeds of the country. The relations with the natives were cordial throughout the explorers' stay amongst them. At first they gathered about the ship without venturing to climb onto it, and the scenes enacted on the passage of the first European vessel through the States were repeated in spite of the long period which had since elapsed. Of the bread, Madeira, and beef offered to them, the natives would taste nothing but the meat; and of the many objects shown to them, they liked pieces of iron and looking-glasses best, amusing themselves with making grimaces in the latter of such absurdity as to keep the crew in fits of laughter. Their general appearance, too, was very provocative of mirth. Their jet-black complexions, blue feathers, and faces streaked with parallel red and white lines, like tick, made up a whole of the greatest absurdity, and many were the hearty laughs the English enjoyed at their expense. Presently disgusted at receiving nothing more than the iron hoops of casks from people possessed of such wealth, they proceeded to annex all they could lay hands on. These thefts were soon detected and put a stop to, but they gave rise to many an amusing scene, and proved the wonderful imitative powers of the natives. "A sailor had given a Fuegan," says Weddell, "a tin pot full of coffee, which he drank, and was using all his art to steal the pot. The sailor, however, recollecting after a while that the pot had not been returned, applied for it, but whatever words he made use of were always repeated in imitation by the Fuegan. At length he became enraged at hearing his requests reiterated, and, placing himself in a threatening attitude, in an angry tone, he said, 'You copper-coloured rascal, where is my tin pot?' The Fuegan, assuming the same attitude, with his eyes fixed on the sailor, called out, 'You copper-coloured rascal, where is my tin pot?' The imitation was so perfect that every one laughed, except the sailor, who proceeded to search him, and under his arm he found the article missing." The sterile mountainous districts in this rigorous climate of Tierra del Fuego furnish no animal fit for food, and without proper clothing or nourishment the people are reduced to a state of complete barbarism. Hunting yields them hardly any game, fishing is almost equally unproductive of results. They are obliged to depend upon the storms which now and then fling up some huge cetacean on their shores, and upon such salvage they fall tooth and nail, not even taking the trouble to cook the flesh. In 1828 Henry Foster, commanding the Chanticleer, received instructions to make observations on the pendulum, with a view to determining the figure of the earth. This expedition extended over 3 years, and was then, that is, in 1831, brought to an end by his violent death by drowning in the river Chagres. We allude to this trip because it resulted, on the 5th January, 1829, in the identification and exploration of the southern Shetlands. The commander himself succeeded in landing, though with great difficulty, on one of these islands, where he collected some specimens of the syenite of which the soil is composed, and a small quantity of red snow, in every respect similar to that found by explorers in the Arctic regions. Of far greater interest, however, was the survey made in 1830 by the whaler John Biscoe. The brig Tula, 140 tons, and the cutter Lively, left London under his orders on the 14th July, 1830. These 2 vessels, the property of Messrs. Enderby, were fitted up for whale fishing, and were in every respect well qualified for the long and arduous task before them, which, according to Biscoe's instructions, was to combine discovery in the Antarctic seas with whaling. After touching at the Falklands, the ships started on the 27th November on a vain search for the Aurora Islands, after which they made for the Sandwich group, doubling its most southerly cape on the 1st January, 1831. In 59 degrees south latitude, masses of ice were encountered, compelling the explorers to give up the southwestern route, in which direction they had noted signs of the existence of land. It was therefore necessary to bear east, skirting along the ice as far as west longitude 9 degrees 34 minutes. It was only on the 16th January that Biscoe was able to cross the 60th parallel of south latitude. In 1775 Cook had here come to a space of open sea 250 miles in extent, yet now an insurmountable barrier of ice checked Biscoe's advance. Continuing his southwesterly course as far as 68 degrees 51 minutes and 10 degrees east longitude, the explorer was struck by the discoloration of the water, the presence of several eaglets and cape pigeons, and the fact that the wind now blew from the south-southwest, all sure tokens of a large continent being near. Ice, however, again barred his progress southwards, and he had to go on in an easterly direction, approaching nearer and nearer to the Antarctic Circle. At length, on the 27th February, says Deborah Cooley, in south latitude 65 degrees 57 minutes and east longitude 47 degrees 20 minutes, land was distinctly seen. This land was of considerable extent, mountainous and covered with snow. Biscoe named it Enderby, and made the most strenuous efforts to reach it, but it was so completely surrounded with ice that he could not succeed. Whilst these attempts were being made, a gale of wind separated the two vessels, and drove them in a southeasterly direction, the land remaining in sight and stretching away from east to west to an extent of more than 200 miles. Bad weather, and the deplorable state of the health of the crew, compelled Biscoe to make for Van Diemen's Land, where he was not rejoined by the Lively until some months later. The explorers had several opportunities of observing the aurora australis, to quote from Biscoe's narrative, or rather the account of his trip drawn up from his log-book and published in the Journal of the Royal Geographical Society. Extraordinarily vivid coruscations of aurora australis were seen, at times rolling, says Captain Biscoe, as it were, over our heads in the form of beautiful columns, then as suddenly changing like the fringe of a curtain, and again shooting across the hemisphere like a serpent; frequently appearing not many yards above our heads, and decidedly within our atmosphere. Leaving Van Diemen's Land on the 11th January, 1832, Biscoe and his two vessels resumed their voyage in a southeasterly direction. The constant presence of floating seaweed, and the number of birds of a kind which never venture far from land, with the gathering of low and heavy clouds, made Biscoe think he was on the eve of some discovery, but storms prevented the completion of his explorations. At last, on the 12th February, in south latitude 64 degrees 10 minutes, albatrosses, penguins, and whales were seen in large quantities, and on the 15th land was seen in the south a long distance off. The next day this land was ascertained to be a large island, to which the name of Adelaide was given, in honour of the Queen of England. On this island were a number of mountains of conical form, with the base very large. In the ensuing days it was ascertained that this was no solitary island, but one of a chain of islets, forming, so to speak, the outworks of a lofty continent. This continent, stretching away for 250 miles in an east-northeast and west-southwest direction, was called Graham, whilst the name of Biscoe was given to the islets in honour of their discoverer. There was no trace either of plants or animals in this country. To make quite sure of the nature of his discovery, Biscoe landed on the 21st February on Graham's Land, and determined the position of a lofty mountain, to which he gave the name of William, in south latitude 64 degrees 45 minutes, and west longitude 66 degrees 11 minutes, reckoning from the Paris meridian. To quote from the Journal of the Royal Geographical Society, the place was in a deep bay, in which the water was so still that could any seals have been found, the vessels would have been easily loaded, as they might have been laid alongside the rocks for the purpose. The depth of the water was also considerable, no bottom being found with 20 fathoms of line almost close to the beach, and the sun was so warm that the snow was melted off all the rocks along the water line, which made it more extraordinary that they should be so utterly deserted. From Graham's Land, Biscoe made for the southern Shetlands, with which it seemed possible the former might be connected, and after touching at the Falkland Islands, where he lost sight of the Lively, he returned to England. As a reward for all he had done, and as an encouragement for the future, Biscoe received medals both from the English and French geographical societies. Very animated were the discussions which now took place as to the existence of a southern continent, and the possibility of penetrating beyond the barrier of ice shutting in the adjacent islands. 3 powers simultaneously resolved to send out an expedition. France entrusted the command of hers to Dumont d'Urville, England chose James Ross, and the United States Lieutenant Charles Wilkes. The last named found himself at the head of a small fleet, consisting of the Porpoise, 2 sloops, the Vincennes and the Peacock, 2 schooners, the Seagull and the Flying Fish, and a transport ship, the Relief, which was sent on in advance to Rio with a reserve of provisions, whilst the others touched at Madeira and the Cape Verde Islands. From the 24th November, 1838, to the 6th January, 1839, the squadron remained in the Bay of Rio de Janeiro, whence it sailed to the Rio Negro, not arriving at Port Orange, Tierra del Fuego, until the 19th February, 1839. There the expedition divided, the Peacock and Flying Fish making for the point where Cook crossed south latitude 60 degrees, and the Relief, with the naturalists on board, penetrating into the Straits of Magellan by one of the passages southeast of Tierra del Fuego, whilst the Vincennes remained at Port Orange, and the Seagull and Porpoise started on the 24th February for the southern seas. Wilkes surveyed Palmer's Island for a distance of 30 miles to a point where it turns in a south-southeast direction, which he called Cape Hope. He then visited the Shetlands and verified the position of several of the islands in that group. After passing 36 days in these inhospitable regions, the 2 vessels steered northwards. A voyage marked by few incidents worthy of record brought Wilkes to Callao, but he had lost sight of the Seagull. The commander now visited the Paumato group, Otaheite, the Society and Navigators Islands, and cast anchor off Sydney on the 29th November. End of section 36. Section 37 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 3, The Great Explorers and Travelers of the 19th Century, by Jules Verne. Second Part, Chapter 3, Part 1, Polar Expeditions 2. On the 29th December, 1839, the expedition once more put to sea and steered for the south, with a view to reaching the most southerly latitude between east longitude 160 degrees and 145 degrees, reckoning from Greenwich, bearing east by west. The vessels were at liberty to follow out separate courses, a rendezvous being fixed in case of their losing sight of each other. Up to January 22nd, numerous signs of land were seen, and some officers even thought they had actually caught sight of it, but it turned out, when the various accounts were compared at the trial Wilkes had to undergo on his return, that it was merely through the accidental deviation before the 22nd January of the Vincennes, in a northerly direction, that the English explorers ascertained the existence of land. Not until he reached Sydney did Wilkes, hearing that d'Urville had discovered land on the 19th January, pretend to have seen it on the same day. These facts are established in a very conclusive article published by the hydrographer, Dawsey, in the Bulletin de la Société de Géographie. Further on we shall see that d'Urville actually landed on the new continent, so that the honour of being the first to discover it is undoubtedly his. The Peacock and Flying Fish, either because they had sustained damages or because of the dangers from the roughness of the sea and floating ice, had steered in a northerly direction from the 24th January to the 5th February, the Vincennes and Porpoise alone continued the arduous voyage as far as east longitude 97 degrees, having land in sight for 2 or 3 miles, which they approached whenever the ice allowed them to do so. On the 29th of January, says Wilkes, in his report to the National Institution of Washington, we entered what I have called Piner's Bay, the only place where we could have landed on the naked rocks. We were driven out of it by one of the sudden gales usual in those seas. We got soundings in 30 fathoms. The gale lasted 36 hours, and after many narrow escapes, I found myself some 60 miles west to leeward of this bay. It now became probable that this land which we had discovered was of great extent, and I deemed it of more importance to follow its trend than to return to Piner's Bay to land, not doubting I should have an opportunity of landing on some portion of it still more accessible. This, however, I was disappointed in, the icy barrier preventing our approach, and rendering it impossible to effect. Great quantities of ice, covered with mud, rock, and stone, presented themselves at the edge of the barrier, in close proximity of the land. From these our specimens were obtained, and were quite as numerous as could have been gathered from the rocks themselves. The land, covered with snow, was distinctly seen in many places, and between them such appearances as to leave little or no doubt in my mind of it being a continuous line of coast, and deserving the name bestowed upon it of the Antarctic continent, lying as it does under that circle. Many phenomena were observed here, and observations made, which will be found under their appropriate head in the sequel. On reaching 97 degrees east, we found the ice trending to the northward, and continuing to follow it close, we reached to within a few miles of the position where Cook was stopped by the barrier in 1773. Piner's Bay, where Wilkes landed, is situated in east longitude 140 degrees, reckoning from Paris. That is to say, it is identical with the place visited by D'Urville on the 21st January. On the 30th January, the Porpoise had come in sight of D'Urville's 2 vessels, and approached to within speaking distance of them, but they put on all sail and appeared anxious to avoid any communication. On his arrival at Sydney, Wilkes found the Peacock in a state of repair, and with that vessel he visited New Zealand, Tonga Tabou, and the Fiji Islands, where 2 of the junior officers of the expedition were massacred by the natives. The Friendly, Navigator, and Sandwich Islands, Admiralty Straits, Puget Sound, Vancouver's Island, the Ladrones, Manila, Sulu, Singapore, the Sunda Islands, St. Helena, and Rio de Janeiro were the halting places on the return voyage, which terminated on the 9th June, 1842, at New York, the explorers having been absent 3 years and 10 months altogether. The results to every branch of science were considerable, and the young Republic of the United States was to be congratulated on a debut so triumphant in the career of discovery. In spite, however, of the interest attaching to the account of this expedition, and to the special treatises by Dana, Gould, Pickering, Gray, Casson, and Brackenbridge, we are obliged to refrain from dwelling on the work done in countries already known. The success of these publications beyond the Atlantic was, as might be expected in a country boasting of so few explorers, immense. Whilst Wilkes was engaged in his explorations, i.e. in 1839, Balleny, captain of the Elizabeth Scott, was adding his quota to the survey of the Antarctic regions. Starting from Campbell Island, on the south of New Zealand, he arrived on the 7th February in south latitude 67 degrees 7 minutes, and west longitude 164 degrees 25 minutes, reckoning from the Paris meridian. Then bearing west, and noting many indications of the neighborhood of land, he discovered 2 days later a black band in the southwest, which, at 6 o'clock in the evening, he ascertained beyond a doubt to be land. This land turned out to be 3 islands of considerable size, and Balleny gave them his own name. As may be imagined, the captain tried to land, but a barrier of ice prevented his doing so. All he could manage was the determination of the position of the central isle, which he fixed at south latitude 66 degrees 44 minutes and west longitude 162 degrees 25 minutes. On the 14th February, a lofty land covered with snow was sighted in the west-southwest. The next day there were but 10 miles between the vessel and the land. It was approached as nearly as possible, and then a boat was put off, but the beach of only 3 or 4 feet wide, with vertical and inaccessible cliffs rising beyond it, rendered landing impossible, and only by getting wet up to their waists were the sailors able to obtain a few specimens of the lava characteristic of this volcanic district. Yet once more, on the 2nd March in south latitude 65 degrees, and about west longitude 120 degrees 24 minutes, land was seen from the deck of the Elizabeth Scott. The vessel was brought to for the night, and the next day an attempt was made to steer in a southwest direction, but it was impossible to get through the ice barrier. Naming the new discovery Sabrina, Balleny resumed his northerly route without being able further to verify his discoveries. In 1837, just as Wilkes had started on his expedition, Captain Dumont d'Urville proposed to the Minister of Marine a new scheme for a voyage round the world. The services rendered by him in 1819-21 in a hydrographic expedition, in 1822 and 1825 on the Coquille under Captain Duperrey, and lastly in 1826-29 on the Astrolabe, had given him an amount of experience which justified him in submitting his peculiar views to the government, and to supplement, so to speak, the mass of information collected by himself and others in these little-known latitudes. The minister at once accepted d'Urville's offer, and exerted himself to find for him enlightened and trustworthy fellow-workers. 2 corvettes, the Astrolabe and the Zélé, fitted up with everything which French experience had proved to be necessary, were placed at his disposal, and amongst his colleagues were many who were subsequently to rise to the rank of general officers, including Jacquinot, commander of the Zélé, Couvent de Bois, Dubouzet, Tardy de Montrevel, and Périgot, all well-known names to those interested in the history of the French Navy. The instructions given by Vice Admiral Rosamel to d'Urville differed from those of his predecessors, chiefly in his being ordered to penetrate as near as the ice would permit to the South Pole. He was also ordered to complete the great work he had begun in 1827 on the Viti Islands, to survey the Salomon Archipelago, to visit the Swan River of Australia, New Zealand, the Chatham Islands, that part of the Caroline group surveyed by Lootka, Mindanao, Borneo, and Batavia, whence he was to return to France via the Cape of Good Hope. These instructions concluded in terms proving the exalted ideas of the government. His Majesty, said Admiral de Rosamel, not only contemplates the progress of hydrography and natural science, but his royal solicitude for the interests of French commerce and the development of the French navy is such as to lead him greatly to extend the terms of your commission, and to hope for great results from it. You will visit numerous places, the resources of which you must study with a view to the interests of our whaling ships, collecting all information likely to be of service to them, alike in facilitating their voyages and rendering those voyages as remunerative as possible. You will touch at those ports where commercial relations with us are already opened, and where the visit of a state vessel will have salutary effects, and at others hitherto closed to our produce, and about which you may on your return give us some valuable details." In addition to the personal good wishes of Louis Philippe, d'Urville received many marks of the most lively interest taken in his work by the Académie des Sciences Morales, and the Geographical Society, but not unfortunately from the Académie des Sciences, although he had for 20 years been working hard to increase the riches of the Museum of Natural History. Whether from prejudice or from whatever cause, says D'Urville, they, the members of the Académie des Sciences, showed very little enthusiasm for the contemplated expedition, and their instructions to me were as formal as they would have been to a complete stranger. It is a matter of regret that the celebrated Arago, the declared enemy of polar researches, was one of the bitterest opponents of the new expedition. This was not, however, the case with various scholars of other nationalities, such as Humboldt and Krusenstern, who wrote to congratulate D'Urville on his approaching voyage and on the important results to science which might be hoped for. After numerous delays, resulting from the fitting up of 2 vessels which were to take the Prince de Joinville to Brazil, the Astrolabe and Zelée at last left Toulon on the 7th September, 1837. The last day of the same month they cast anchor off Santa Cruz de Tenerife, which D'Urville chose as a halting place in preference to one of the Cape Verde Islands, in the hope of laying in a stock of wine, and also of being able to take some magnetic observations, which he had been blamed for neglecting in 1826, although it was well known that he was not then in a fit state to attend to such things. In spite of the eagerness of the young officers to go and enjoy themselves on shore, they had to submit to a quarantine of 4 days, on account of rumours of cases of plague having occurred in the lazaretto of Marseilles. Without pausing to relate the details of Messrs. Dubouzet, Couvin, and Dumoulin's ascent of the peak, we will merely quote a few enthusiastic remarks of Couvin des Bois. "Arrived," says that officer, "at the foot of the peak, we spent the last hour of the ascent in crossing cinders and broken stones, arriving at last at the longed-for goal, the loftiest point of this huge volcano. The smoking crater presented the appearance of a hollow sulphurous semicircle about 1,200 feet wide and 300 feet deep, covered with the debris of pumice and other stones. The thermometer, which had marked 5 degrees at 10 a.m., got broken through being placed on the ground where there was an escape of sulphuric vapor. There were upon the sides and in the crater numerous fumaroles, which send forth the native sulphur, which forms the base of the peak. The rush of the vapor is so rapid as to sound like shots from a cannon. The heat of the ground is so great in some parts that it is impossible to stand on it for a minute at a time. Look around you, and see if these 3 mountains piled one upon the other do not resemble a staircase built up by giants, on which to climb to heaven. Gaze upon the vast streams of lava, all issuing from one point, which form the crater, and which a few centuries back you could not have trodden upon with impunity. See the Canaries in the distance. Look down, ye pygmies, on the sea, with its breakers dashing against the shores of the island, of which you for the moment form the summit. See for once, as God sees, and be rewarded for your exertions, ye travellers, whose enthusiasm for the grand scenes of nature has brought you some 12,182 feet above the level of the ocean." We must add that the explorers testified to the brilliancy of the stars as seen from the summit of the peak, the clearness of all sounds, and also to the giddiness and headache known as mountain sickness. Whilst part of the staff were engaged in this scientific excursion, several other officers visited the town, where they noticed nothing special except a narrow walk called the Alameda, and the church of the Franciscans. The neighbourhood, however, is interesting enough on account of the curious aqueducts for supplying the town with water, and the Mercede forest, which, in D'Urville's opinion, might more justly be called a coppice, for it contains nothing but shrubs and ferns. The population seemed happy, but extremely lazy; economical, but horribly dirty; and the less said about their morals the better. On the 12th October the 2 vessels put out to sea again, intending to reach the polar regions as soon as possible. Motives of humanity, however, determined D'Urville to change his plans and touch at Rio, the state of an apprentice with disease of the lungs becoming so rapidly worse that a stay in the Arctic regions would probably have been fatal. The vessels cast anchor in the roadstead, not the Bay of Rio, on the 13th November, but they only remained there one day, that is to say, just long enough to land young Duparre, and to lay in a stock of provisions. The southerly route was then resumed. For a long time D'Urville had wished to explore the Strait of Magellan, not with a view to further hydrographical surveys, for the careful explorations of Captain King, begun in 1826, had been finished in 1834 by Fitzroy, leaving little to be done in that direction, but to gather the rich and still unappropriated harvest of facts relating to natural history. How intensely interesting it was, too, to note how real had been the dangers encountered by early navigators, such as the sudden veering of the wind, etc. What a good thing it would be to obtain further and more detailed information about the famous Patagonians, the subject of so many fables and controversies. Yet another motive led D'Urville to anchor off Port Famine, rather than off Staten Island. His perusal of the accounts of the work of explorers who had penetrated into the southern seas convinced him that the end of January and the whole of February were the best times for visiting these regions, for then only are the effects of the annual thaw over, and with them the risk of over-fatigue to the crews. This resolution once taken, D'Urville communicated it to Captain Jaquenot, and set sail for the strait. On the 12th December Cape Virgin was sighted, and Dumoulin, seconded by the young officers, began a grand series of hydrographical surveys. In the intricate navigation of the strait, D'Urville, we are told, showed equal courage and calmness, skill and presence of mind, completely winning over to his side many of the sailors, who, when they had seen him going along at Toulon when suffering with the gout, had exclaimed, "Oh, that old fellow won't take us far." Now, when his constant vigilance had brought the vessels safely out of the strait, the cry was, "The man is mad. He's made us scrape against rocks, reefs, and land, as if he had never taken a voyage before, and we used to think him as useless as a rotten keel." We must now say a few words on the stay at Port Famine. Landing is easy, and there is a good spring and plenty of wood. On the rocks are found quantities of mussels, limpets, and whelks, whilst inland grows celery and a kind of herb resembling the dandelion. Another fruitful source of wealth in this bay is fish, and whilst the vessels were at anchor, dragnets, trammels, and lines captured enough mullet, gudgeon, and roaches to feed the whole crew. "As I was about to re-embark," says D'Urville, "a little barrel was brought to me, which had been found hung on a tree on the beach, near a post on which was written, Post Office. Having ascertained that this barrel contained papers, I took it on board and examined them. They consisted of notes of captains who had passed through the Straits of Magellan, stating the time of their visits, the incidents of their passage, with advice to those who should come after them, and letters for Europe or the United States. It seemed that an American captain, Cunningham by name, had been the originator of this open-air post office. He had merely, in April 1833, hung a bottle on a tree, and his fellow countryman, Waterhouse, had supplemented it by the post with its inscription. Lastly, Captain Carrick of the schooner MaryAnn, from Liverpool, passed through the strait in March 1837, on his way to San Blas, California, going through it again a second time on his way back on the 29th November, 1837. That is to say, 16 days before our own visit, and he it was who had substituted the barrel for the bottle, adding an invitation to all who should succeed him to use it as a receptacle of letters for different destinations. I mean to improve this ingenious and useful contrivance by forming an actual post office on the highest point of the peninsula, with an inscription in letters of a size so gigantic as to compel the attention of navigators who would not otherwise have touched at Port Famine. Curiosity will then probably lead them to send a canoe to examine the box, which will be fastened to the post. It seems likely that we shall ourselves reap the first fruits of this arrangement, and our families will be agreeably surprised to receive news from us from this wild and lonely district, just before our plunge into the ice of the polar regions." At low tide the mouth of the Sedger River, which flows into Famine Bay, is encumbered with sandbanks. Some 1,000 feet further on the plain is transformed into a vast marsh, from which rise the trunks of immense trees, and huge bones, bleached by the action of time, which have been brought down by the heavy rainfall, swelling the course of the stream. Skirting this marsh is a fine forest, the entrance to which is protected by prickly shrubs. The commonest trees are the beech, with trunks between 80 and 90 feet high, and 3 or 4 feet in diameter. Winteria aromatica, a kind of bark which has long since replaced the cinnamon and a species of barberry. The largest beeches seen by D'Urville measured 15 feet in diameter, and were about 150 feet high. Unfortunately, no mammiferous animals or reptiles, or fresh or salt water shellfish, are found on these coasts, and 1 or 2 different kinds of birds, with a few lichens and mosses, were all the naturalist was able to obtain. Several officers went up the Sedger in a yawl until they were stopped by the shallowness of the water. They were then 7½ miles from the mouth, and they noted the width of the river where it flows into the sea to be between 90 and 100 feet. "It would be difficult," says M. de Montrevel, "to imagine a more picturesque scene than was spread out before us at every turn. Everywhere was that indescribable wildness which cannot be imitated, a confused mass of trees, broken branches, trunks covered with moss, which seemed literally to grow before our eyes." To resume, the stay at Port Famine was most successful. Wood and water were easily obtained, repairs, etc., were made, horary, physical, meteorological, tidal, and hydrographical observations were taken, and, lastly, numerous objects of natural history were collected, the more interesting as the museums of France hitherto contained nothing whatever from these unknown regions beyond "a few plants collected by Commerson and preserved in the herbarium of M. de Jussieu." On the 28th December, 1837, anchor was weighed without a single Patagonian having been seen, although the officers and crew had been so eager to make acquaintance with the natives. The difficulties attending navigation compelled the 2 corvettes to cast anchor a little further on, off Port Gallant, the shores of which, bordered by fine trees, are cut by torrents resembling a little distance off magnificent cascades from 50 to 60 feet high. This compulsory halt was not wasted, for a large number of new plants were collected, and the port with the neighbouring bays were surveyed. The commander, however, finding the season already so far advanced, gave up his idea of going out at the westerly end of the strait, and went back the way he came, hoping thus to get an interview with the Patagonians before going to the polar regions. St. Nicholas Bay, called by Bougainville the Baie des Français, where the explorers passed New Year's Day 1838, is a much pleasanter looking spot than Port Gallant. The usual hydrographical surveys were there brought to a satisfactory issue by the officers under the direction of Dumoulin. A boat was dispatched to Cape Remarkable, where Bougainville said he had seen fossil shells, which, however, turned out to be nothing but little pebbles embedded in a calcareous gang. Interesting experiments were made with the thermometrograph, or marine thermometer, at 290 fathoms, without reaching the bottom, at less than 2 miles from land. Whereas the temperature was 9 degrees on the surface, it was but 2 at the above-named depth, and as it is scarcely likely that currents convey the waters of the 2 oceans so far down, one is driven to the belief that this is the usual temperature at such depths. End of section 37. Section 38 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 3, The Great Explorers and Travelers of the 19th Century, by Jules Verne. Second part, Chapter 3, Part 1, Polar Expeditions, 3. The vessels now made for Tierra del Fuego, where Dumoulin resumed his surveys. Low, exposed, and strewn with rocks which serve as landmarks, there were but few dangers to be encountered here. Magdalena Island, Gente Grande Bay, Elizabeth Island, and Oazy Harbor, where the camp of a large party of Patagonians was made out with the telescope, and Peckett Harbor, where the astrolabe struck in 3 fathoms, were successively passed. As we struck, says D'Urville, there were signs of astonishment and even of excitement amongst the crew, and some grumbling was already audible, when in a firm voice I ordered silence, and without appearing at all put out by what had happened, I cried, "This is nothing at all, and we shall have plenty more of the same kind of thing." Later these words often recurred to the memory of our sailors. It is more difficult than one would suppose for a captain to maintain perfect calmness and impassiveness in the midst of the worst dangers, even those he has reason to imagine likely to be fatal." Peckett Harbor was alive with Patagonians, and officers and men were alike eager to land. A crowd of natives on horseback were waiting for them at the place of disembarkation. Gentle and peaceable, they readily replied to the questions put to them, and looked quietly at everything shown to them, expressing no special desire for anything offered to them. They did not seem either to be at all addicted to thieving, and when on board the French vessels they made no attempt to carry anything off. Their usual height is from 4½ to 5 feet, but some are a good deal shorter. Their limbs are large and plump, without being muscular, and their extremities are of extraordinary smallness. Their most noteworthy characteristic is the breadth of the lower part of the face as compared to the forehead, which is low and retreating. Long narrow eyes, high cheekbones, and a flat nose give them something of the resemblance to the Mongolian type. They are evidently extremely languid and indolent, and wanting in strength and agility. Looking at them squatting down, standing, or walking, with their long hair flowing down their backs, one would take them for the women of a harem rather than savages used to enduring the inclemency of the weather and to struggle for existence. Stretched upon skins with their dogs and horses about them, their chief amusement is to catch the vermin with which they swarm. They hate walking so much that they mount horses just to go down and pick up shells on the beach a few yards off. A white man was living amongst these Patagonians, a miserable, decrepit-looking fellow who said he came from the United States, but he spoke English very imperfectly, and the explorers took him to be a German Swiss. Niederhauser, so he called himself, had gone to seek his fortune in the United States, and that fortune being long on the road, he had given ear to the wonderful proposals of a certain whaleman, who wanted to complete his crew. By this whaleman he was left with 7 others and some provisions on a desert island off Tierra del Fuego to hunt seals and dress their skins. 4 months later the schooner returned laden with skins, left the seal hunters fresh provisions, went off again, and never came back. Whether it had been shipwrecked, or whether the captain had abandoned his sailors, it was impossible to ascertain. When the poor fellows found themselves deserted and their provisions exhausted, they embarked in their canoe and rowed up the Straits of Magellan, soon meeting with some Patagonians, with whom Niederhauser remained, whilst his companions went on. Well received by the natives, he lived their life with them, faring well when food was plentiful, drawing in his belt and living on roots when food was scarce. Weary, however, of this miserable existence, Niederhauser entreated D'Urville to take him on board, urging that another month of the life he was leading would kill him. The captain consented, and received him as a passenger. During his 3 months' residence amongst them Niederhauser had learned something of the language of the Patagonians, and with his aid D'Urville drew up a comparative vocabulary of a great many words in Patagonian, French, and German. The war costume of the Fuegians includes a helmet of tanned leather protected by steel plates, and surmounted by a crest of cock's feathers, a tunic of ox hide dyed red with yellow stripes, and a kind of double-bladed scimitar. The chief of Peckett Harbour allowed his visitors to take his portrait in full martial costume, thereby showing his superiority to his subjects, who would not do the same for fear of witchcraft. On the 8th January anchor was finally weighed, and the second entrance to the strait was slowly navigated against the tide. The Straits of Magellan having now been crossed from end to end, and a survey made of the whole of the eastern portion of Tierra del Fuego, thus bridging over an important gulf in hydrographic knowledge, no detailed map of this coast having previously been made, the vessels steered for the polar regions, doubling Staten Island without difficulty, and on the 15th January coming in sight of the first ice, an event causing no little emotion, for now was to begin the really hard work of the voyage. Floating ice was not the only danger to be encountered in these latitudes. A dense fog, which the keenest sight could not penetrate, soon gathered about the vessels, paralyzing their movements, and though they were under a foresail only, rendering a collision with the ice masses imminent. The temperature fell rapidly, and the thermometrograph marked only 2 degrees on the surface of the sea, whilst the deep water was below zero. Half-melted snow now began to fall, and everything bore witness that the Antarctic regions were indeed entered. Clarence, New South Orkney Islands, could not be identified. Everyone's attention had to be concentrated on avoiding blocks of ice. At midday on the 20th January the vessels were in south latitude 62 degrees 3 minutes and west longitude 49 degrees 56 minutes, not far from the place where Powell encountered compact ice fields, and an immense ice island was soon sighted, some 6,000 feet in extent and 300 in height, with perpendicular sides greatly resembling land under certain conditions of the light. Numerous whales and penguins were now seen swimming about the vessels, whilst white petrels continually flew across them. On the 21st observations gave south latitude 62 degrees 53 minutes, and D'Urville was expecting soon to reach the 65th parallel, when at 3 a.m. he was told that further progress was arrested by an iceberg, across which it did not seem possible to cut a passage. The vessels were at once put about and slowly steered in an easterly direction, the wind having fallen. We were thus enabled, says D'Urville, to gaze at our leisure upon the wonderful spectacle spread out before our eyes. Severe and grand beyond expression, it not only excited the imagination, but filled the heart with involuntary terror. Nowhere else is man's powerlessness more forcibly brought before him. A new world displays itself to him, but it's a motionless, gloomy, and silent world, where everything threatens the annihilation of human faculties. Should he have the misfortune to be left alone here, no help, no consolation, no spark of hope would soothe his last moments. One is involuntarily reminded of the famous inscription on the gate of the Inferno of Dante: Lasciate ogni speranza, voi centrante. D'Urville now set to work on a very strange task, which, as compared with others of a similar kind, was likely to be of considerable value. He had an exact measurement taken of the outlines of the iceberg. Had other navigators done the same, we should have had some precise information as to the direction taken by icebergs, their movements, etc., in the southern polar regions, a subject still wrapped in the greatest obscurity. On the 22nd, after doubling a point, it was ascertained that the iceberg was bearing south-southwest by west. A lofty and broken piece of land was sighted in these latitudes. Dumoulin began to survey it, and D'Urville was about, as he thought, to identify it with the New South Greenland of Morel, when its outlines became dim and it sunk beneath the horizon. On the 24th the two corvettes crossed a series of floating islets, and entered a plain where the ice was melting. The passage, however, became narrower and narrower, and they were obliged to veer round, to save themselves from being blocked in. Everything pointed to the conclusion that the edge of the ice was melting, the ice islands fell apart with loud reports, the ice running off in little rivulets. There was undoubtedly a thaw, and Fanning had been right in saying that these latitudes should not be visited before February. D'Urville now decided to steer for the north, and try to reach the islands of New South Orkney, the map of which had not yet been accurately laid down. The commander was anxious to survey that archipelago thoroughly, and to spend several days there before resuming his southerly course, so as to be in the Antarctic regions at the same time of year as Weddell. For 3 days the explorer coasted along the southern shores of New South Orkney without being able to land. He then once more turned southwards, and came in sight of the ice again in south latitude 62 degrees 20 minutes, and west longitude 39 degrees 28 minutes. A few minutes before midday a kind of opening was discovered, through which the vessels were forced at all risks. This bold manoeuvre was successful, and in spite of the heavy snow, the explorers penetrated into a small basin scarcely 2 miles in extent, and hemmed in on every side by lofty walls of ice. It was decided to make fast to the ice, and when the order to cast anchor was given, a young middy on board the Zélé cried naively, "Is there a port here? I shouldn't have thought there were people living on the ice." Great indeed was now the joyful enthusiasm on both vessels. Some of the young officers of the Zélé had come to empty a bowl of punch with their comrades of the Astrolabe, and the commander could hear their shouts of delight from his bed. He himself did not, however, look upon the situation in quite the same favourable light. He felt that he had done a very imprudent thing. Shut into a cul-de-sac, he could only go out as he had come, and that he could not do until he had the wind right aft. At 11 o'clock D'Urville was awoke by a violent shock, accompanied by a noise of breaking, as if the vessel had struck on some rocks. He got up, and saw that the Astrolabe, having drifted, had struck violently against the ice, where she remained exposed to collision with the masses of ice which the current was sweeping along more rapidly than it did the vessel herself. When day dawned, the adventurers found themselves surrounded by ice, but in the north a blackish-blue line seemed to betray the existence of an open sea. This direction was at once taken, but a thick fog immediately and completely enveloped both ships, and when it cleared off they found themselves face to face with a compact ice barrier, beyond which stretched away as far as the eye could reach, an open sea. D'Urville now resolved to cut himself a passage, and began operations by dashing the Astrolabe with all possible speed against the obstacle. The vessel penetrated 2 or 3 lengths into the ice, and then remained motionless. The crew climbed out of her onto the ice, armed with pickaxes, pincers, mattocks, and saws, and merrily endeavoured to cut a passage. The fragment of ice was already nearly crossed when the wind changed, and the motion of the waves in the offing began to be felt, causing the officers to agree in urging a retreat into the shelter of the ice walls, for there was some danger if the wind freshened of the vessel being embayed against the ice and beaten to pieces by the waves and floating debris. The corvettes had traversed 12 or 15 miles for nothing, when an officer, perched in the shrouds, sighted a passage in the east-northeast. That direction was at once taken, but again it was found impossible to cut a passage, and when night came the crew had to make the ship fast to a huge block of ice. The loud cracking noises which had awoke the commander the night before now began with such violence that it really seemed impossible for the vessel to live till daylight. After an interview with the captain of the Zélé, however, D'Urville made for the north, but the day passed without any change being effected in the position of the vessels, and the next day, during a storm of sleet, the swell of the sea became so powerful as completely to raise the ice plain in which they were imprisoned. More careful watch than ever had now to be kept, to guard against the pieces of ice flung long distances by this motion, and the rudder had to be protected from them by a kind of wooden hut. With the exception of a few cases of ophthalmia, resulting from the continual glare of the snow, the health of the crews was satisfactory, and this was no little satisfaction to the leaders of the expedition, compelled as they were to be continually on the qui vive. Not until the 9th February were the vessels, favored by a strong breeze, able to get off, and once more enter a really open sea. The ice had been coasted for a distance of 225 leagues. The vessels had actually sustained no further damage than the loss of a few spars and a considerable portion of the copper sheathing, involving no further leakage than there had been before. The next day the sun came out, and observations could be taken, giving the latitude as 62 degrees 9 minutes south, and the longitude 39 degrees 22 minutes west. Snow continued to fall, the cold was intense, and the wind very violent for the 3 succeeding days. This continuance of bad weather, together with the increasing length of the nights, warned D'Urville of the necessity of giving up all idea of going further. When, therefore, he found himself in south latitude 62 degrees and west longitude 33 degrees 11 minutes, in other words, in that part of the ocean where Weddell had been able to sail freely in 1823, and the new explorer had met with nothing but impassable ice, he steered for New South Orkney. A whole month passed amongst the ice and fogs of the Antarctic Ocean had told upon the health of the crews, and nothing could be gained for science by a continuance of the cruise. On the 20th the archipelago was again sighted, and D'Urville was once more driven out of his course in a northerly direction by the ice, but he was able to put off with 2 boats, the crews of which collected on Weddell Island a large number of geological specimens, lichens, etc., and some 20 penguins and chionis. On the 25th February Clarence Island was seen, forming the eastern extremity of the New South Shetland archipelago, a very steep and rugged district covered with snow except on the beach, and thence the explorers steered towards Elephant Island, resembling Clarence Island in every respect, except that it is strewn with peaks rising up black against the plains of snow and ice. The islets of Narrow, Biggs, O'Brien, and Aspland were successively identified, but covered as they are with snow, they are perfectly inaccessible to man. The little volcano of Bridgeman was also seen, and the naturalists tried in vain to land upon it from 2 boats. The general colour of the soil, says the narrative, is red, like that of burnt brick with particles of grey, suggestive of the presence of pumice stone or of calcined cinders. Here and there on the beach are seen great blackish-looking blocks, which are probably lava. This islet has, however, only one true crater, although thick columns of smoke are emitted from it, nearly all of them issuing from the base on the western side, whilst in the north are 2 other fumaroles, 30 or 40 feet along the water. There are none on the eastern or northern side or at the top, which is smooth and round. The bulk appears recently to have undergone some considerable modification, as indeed it must have done, or it could not now resemble so little the description given by Powell in December 1822." D'Urville soon resumed his southerly route, and on the 27th February sighted a considerable belt of land in the south-east, on which he was prevented from landing by the fog and the continuous fall of very fine snow. He was now in the latitude of Hope Island, i.e. in south latitude 62 degrees 57 minutes. He approached it very closely, and sighted before reaching it a low-lying land, to which he gave the name of Joinville. Then further on in the southwest he came to an extensive district which he named Louis Philippe, and between the two in a kind of channel, encumbered with ice, an island he called Rosamel. Now, says D'Urville, The horizon was so light that we could trace all the irregularities of Louis Philippe's land. We could see it stretching away from Mount Bransfield in the north, 62 degrees west longitude, to the south-southwest, where it faded away on the horizon. From Mount Bransfield to the south it is lofty, and of fairly uniform surface, resembling a vast, unbroken ice field. In the south, however, it rises in the form of a fine peak, Mount Jacquinot, which is equal perhaps, indeed superior, to Bransfield. But beyond this peak it stretches away in the form of a mountain chain, ending in the southwest in a peak loftier than any of the others. For the rest, the effect of the snow and ice, together with the absence of any objects with which they can be compared, aid in exaggerating the height of all irregularities, and, as a matter of fact, the results of the measurements taken by M. Dumoulin showed all these mountains, which then appeared to us gigantic and equal to the Alps and Pyrenees at least, to be after all of a very medium size. Mount Bransfield, for instance, was not more than about 2,068 feet high, Mount Jacquinot 2,121 feet, and Mount D'Urville, the loftiest of them all, about 3,047 feet. Except for the islets grouped about the mainland, and a few peaks rising above the snow, the whole country is one long series of compact blocks of ice, and it is impossible to do more than trace the outlines of this ice crust, those of the land itself being quite indistinguishable." On the 1st March, soundings gave only 80 fathoms with a bottom of rock and gravel. The temperature is 1.9 degrees on the surface and 0.2 at the bottom of the sea. On the 2nd of March, off Louis Philippe's land, an island was sighted which was named Astrolabe, and on the day after a large bay, or rather strait, to which the name of Orleans Channel was given, was surveyed between Louis Philippe's land and a lofty rocky belt, which D'Urville took for the beginning of Trinity Land, hitherto very inaccurately laid down. From the 26th February then to the 5th March, D'Urville remained in sight of the coast, skirting along it a little distance off, but unable entirely to regulate his course on account of the incessant fogs and rain. Everything bore witness to the setting in of a very decided thaw, the temperature rising at midday to 5 degrees above zero, whilst the ice was everywhere melting and running off in little streams of water, or falling with a formidable crush into the sea in the form of blocks, the wind meanwhile blowing strongly from the west. All this decided D'Urville against the further prosecution of this voyage. The sea was heavy, the rain and fog incessant. It was therefore necessary to leave this dangerous coast and make for the north, where on the following day he surveyed the most westerly islands of the New Shetland group. D'Urville next steered for Conception, and very arduous was the voyage there, for, in spite of every precaution, the crews of both corvettes, especially that of the Zelée, were attacked with scurvy. It was now that D'Urville measured the heights of some of the waves, with a view to the disproving of the charge of exaggeration which had been brought against him when he had estimated those that he had seen break over Needle Bank at a height of between 80 and 100 feet. With the help of some of his officers, that there might be no doubt as to his accuracy, D'Urville measured some waves of which the vertical height was 35 feet, and which measured not less than 196½ feet from the crest to the lowest point, making a total length of 393 feet for a single wave. These measurements were an answer to the ironical assertion of Arago, who, settling the matter in his own study, would not allow that a wave could exceed from 5 to 6 feet in height. One need not hesitate a single moment to accept, as against the eminent but impulsive physicist, the measurements of the navigators who had made observations upon the spot. On the 7th April, 1838, the expedition cast anchor in Talcahuano Bay, where the rest so sorely needed by the 40 scrofulous patients of the Zelée was obtained. Thence D'Urville made for Valparaiso, after which, having entirely crossed Oceania, he cast anchor on the 1st January, 1839, off Guam, arrived at Battina in October, and went thence to Hobart's Town, whence on the 1st January 1840 he started on a new trip in the Antarctic regions. At this time D'Urville knew nothing either of Balinese voyage or of the discovery of Sabrina's land. He merely intended to go round the southern extremity of Tasmania with a view to ascertaining beneath which parallel he would meet with ice. He was under the impression that the space between 120 degrees and 160 degrees east longitude had not yet been explored, so that there was still a discovery to be made. At first, navigation was beset with the greatest difficulties. The swell was very strong, the currents bore in an easterly direction, the sanitary condition of the crews was far from satisfactory, and 58 degrees south latitude had not yet been reached when the presence of ice was ascertained. The cold soon became very intense, the wind veered round to the west-northwest, and the sea became calm, a sure indication of the neighbourhood of land or of ice. The former was the more generally received hypothesis, for the ice islands passed were too large to have been formed in the open ocean. On the 18th January, south latitude 64 degrees was reached, and great perpendicular blocks of ice were met with, the height of which varied from 90 to 100 feet, whilst the breadth exceeded 3,000. The next day, January 19th, 1840, a new land was sighted, to which the name of Availle was given. The sun was now burning hot, and the ice all seemed to be melting, immense streams running down from the summits of the rocks into the sea. The appearance of the land was monotonous, covered as it was with snow. It ran from west to east, and seemed to slope gradually down to the sea. On the 21st the wind allowed the vessels to approach the beach, and deep ravines were soon made out, evidently the result of the action of melted snow. As the ships advanced, navigation became more and more perilous, for the ice islands were so numerous that there was hardly a large enough channel between them for any manoeuvring. Their straight walls, says D'Urville, rose far above our masts, glowering down upon our vessels, which appeared of absurdly small dimensions as compared with their huge masses. The spectacle spread out before us was alike grand and terrible. One might have fancied oneself in the narrow streets of a city of giants. The corvettes soon entered a huge basin, formed by the coast and the ice islands which had just been passed. The land stretched away in the southeast and northwest as far as the eye could reach. It was between 3,000 and 4,000 feet high, but nowhere presented any very salient features. In the centre of the vast snow plain rose a few rocks. The two captains at once sent off boats with orders to bring back specimens which should testify to the discovery made. We quote from the account of Dubouzet. One of the officers told off on this important survey. "It was nearly 9 o'clock when to our great delight we landed on the western side of the most westerly and loftiest islet. The Astrolabe boat had arrived 1 moment before ours, and its crew were already clambering up the steep sides of the rock, flinging down the penguins as they went, the birds showing no small surprise at being thus summarily dispossessed of the island, of which they had been hitherto the only inhabitants. I at once sent one of our sailors to unfurl a tricolour flag on these territories, which no human creature had seen or trod before ourselves. According to the old custom, to which the English have clung tenaciously, we took possession of them in the name of France, together with the neighbouring coast, which we were prevented from visiting by the ice. The only representatives of the animal kingdom were the penguins, for in spite of all our researches we did not find a single shell. The rocks were quite bare, without so much as the slightest sign of a lichen. We had to fall back on the mineral kingdom. We each took a hammer and began chipping at the rock, but, it being of granite, was so extremely hard that we could only obtain very small bits. Fortunately, in climbing to the summit of the island, the sailors found some big pieces of rock broken off by the frost, and these they embarked in their boats. Looking closely at them, I noticed an exact resemblance between these rocks and the little bits of gneiss which we had found in the stomach of a penguin we had killed the day before. The little islet on which we landed is part of a group of 8 or 10 of similar character and form. They are between 500 and 600 yards from the nearest coast. We also noticed on the beach several peaks and a cape quite free from snow. These islets, close as they are to each other, seem to form a continuous chain parallel with the coast, and stretching away from east to west." End of section 38.
Section 39 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Piotr. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 3. The Great Explorers and Travelers of the 19th Century, by Jules Verne. Second part, Chapter 3, Part 1, Polar Expeditions. 4. On the 22nd and 23rd the survey of this coast was continued. On the second day an iceberg soldered to the coast compelled the vessels to turn back towards the north, whilst at the same time a sudden and violent snowstorm overtook and separated them. The Zulee especially sustained considerable damage, but was able to rejoin her consort the next day. Throughout it all, however, sight of the land had not, so to speak, been lost, but on the 29th the wind blew so strongly and persistently from the east that D'Urville had to abandon the survey of Availle Land. It was on this same day that he sighted the vessels of Lieutenant Wilkes. D'Urville complains of the discourtesy of the latter, and says that his own manoeuvres, intended to open communications with them, had been misunderstood by the Americans. "We are no longer," he says, "in the days when navigators, in the interests of commerce, thought it necessary carefully to conceal their route and their discoveries, to avoid the competition of rival nations. I should, on the contrary, have been glad to point out to our emulators the result of our researches, in the hope that such information might be of use to them and increase our geographical knowledge." On the 30th of January a huge wall of ice was sighted, as to the nature of which opinions were divided. Some said it was a compact and isolated mass. Others, and this was D'Urville's opinion, thought these lofty mountains had a base of earth or of rocks, or that they might even be bulwarks of a huge extent of land, which they called Clarie. It is situated in 128 degrees eastern longitude. The officers had collected sufficient information in these latitudes to determine the position of the southern magnetic pole, but the results obtained by them did not accord with those given by Duperrey, Wilkes, and Ross. On the 17th of February the two corvettes once more cast anchor off Hobartstown, and on the 25th set sail again for New Zealand, where they completed the hydrographical surveys of the Uranie. They then made for New Guinea, ascertained that it was not separated by a strait from the Louisiade Archipelago, surveyed Torres Strait with the greatest care, in spite of dangers from currents, coral reefs, etc., arrived at Timor on the 20th, and returned to Toulon on the 8th November, after touching at Bourbon and St. Helena. When the news of the grand discoveries made by the United States reached England, a spirit of emulation was aroused, and the learned societies decided on sending an expedition to the regions in which Weddell and Biscoe had been the only explorers since the time of Cook. Captain James Clark Ross, who was appointed to the command of this expedition, was the nephew of the famous John Ross, explorer of Baffin's Bay. Born in 1800, James Ross was a sailor from the age of 12. He accompanied his uncle in 1818 in his first Arctic expedition, had taken part under Parry in 4 expeditions to the same latitudes, and from 1829 to 1833 he had been his uncle's constant and faithful companion. Entrusted with the taking of scientific observations, he had discovered the North Magnetic Pole, and he had also made a good many excursions across the ice on foot and in sledges. He was, therefore, now one of the most experienced of British naval officers in polar expeditions. 2 vessels, the Erebus and the Terror were entrusted to him, and his second in command was an accomplished sailor, Captain Francis Rawdon Crozier, companion of Parry in 1824, of Ross in 1835 in Baffin's Bay, and the future companion of Franklin in the Terror, in his search for the North West Passage. It would have been impossible to find a braver or more experienced sailor. The instructions given to James Ross by the Admiralty differed essentially from those received by Wilkes and Dumont d'Urville. For the latter, the exploration of the Antarctic regions was but one incident of their voyage round the world, whereas it was the very raison d'être of Ross's journey. Of the 3 years he would be away from Europe, the greater part was to be spent in the Antarctic regions, and he would only leave the ice to repair the damages to his vessels, or recruit the health of his crew, worn out as they would probably be by fatigue and sickness. The vessels had been equally judiciously chosen. Stronger than those of D'Urville, they were better fitted to resist the repeated assaults of the ice, and their seasoned crews had been chosen from sailors familiar with polar navigation. The Erebus and Terror, under the command of Ross and Crozier, left England on the 29th of September 1839, and touched successively at Madeira, the Cape Verde Islands, St. Helena, and the Cape of Good Hope, where numerous magnetic observations were taken. On the 12th of April Ross reached Kerguelen's Island, and there landed the instruments. The scientific harvest was abundant. Some fossil trees were extracted from the lava of which this island is formed, and some rich layers of coal were discovered, which have not yet been worked. The 29th was fixed for simultaneous magnetic observations in different parts of the globe, and by a singular coincidence some magnetic storms, such as had already visited Europe, were on this very day observed in these latitudes. The instrument registered the same phenomena as at Toronto, Canada, proving the vast extent of these meteoric disturbances, and incredible rapidity with which they spread. On his arrival at Hobart Town, where his old friend John Franklin was now governor, Ross heard of the discovery of Adélie and of Clarie lands by the French, and the simultaneous survey of them by Wilkes, who had even left a sketch of his map of the coasts. Ross, however, decided to make for eastern longitude 170 degrees, because it was in that direction that Balleny had found an open sea extending to southern latitude 69 degrees. He duly reached first the Auckland and then the Campbell Islands, and after having, like his predecessors, tacked about a great deal in a sea strewn with ice islands, he came beyond the 63rd degree to the edge of the stationary ice, and on the 1st of January 1841 crossed the Antarctic Circle. The floating ice did not in any respect resemble that of the Arctic regions, as James Ross very soon discovered. It consisted of huge blocks, with regular and vertical walls, whilst the ice fields, less compact than those of the north, move about in chaotic confusion, looking, to quote Wilkes' imaginative simile, like a heaving land, as they alternately break away from each other and reunite. To Ross the ice barrier did not present so formidable an appearance as it had done to the French and the Americans. He did not at first venture upon it, however, being kept in the offing by storms. Not until the 5th of January was he able to penetrate to southern latitude 66 degrees 45 minutes and eastern longitude 174 degrees 16 minutes. Circumstances could not have been more favourable, for the sea and wind were both acting upon and loosening the ice, and thanks to the strength of his vessels, Ross was able to cut a passage. As he advanced further and further southward, the fog became denser, and the constant snowstorms added to the already serious dangers of navigation. Encouraged, however, by the reflection in the sky of an open sea, a phenomenon which turned out to be trustworthy, he pushed on, and on the 9th of January, after crossing 200 miles of ice, he actually entered that open sea. On the 11th of January land was sighted 100 miles ahead, in southern latitude 70 degrees 47 minutes, and eastern longitude 172 degrees 36 minutes. This, the most southern land ever yet discovered, consisted of snow-clad peaks with glaciers sloping down to the sea, the peaks rising to a height of from 9 to 12,000 feet. This estimate, judging from D'Urville's remark on Graham's Land, may however possibly be an exaggerated one. Here, there, and everywhere black rocks rose up from the snow, but the coast was so shut in with ice that landing was impossible. This curious series of huge peaks received the name of Admiralty Chain, and the country itself that of Victoria. A few little islands were made out in the south-east before the vessels left this coast, and on the 12th of January the two captains, with some of their officers, disembarked on one of the volcanic islets, and took possession of it in the name of England. Not the slightest trace of vegetation was found upon it. Ross soon ascertained that the eastern side of this vast land sloped towards the south, whilst the northern stretched away to the northwest. He therefore skirted along the eastern beach, forcing a passage in a southerly direction beyond the magnetic pole, which he places near southern latitude 76 degrees, and then returning by the west, thus entirely circumnavigating his new discovery, which he looked upon as a very large island. The mountain chain extends all along the coast. Ross gave to the principal peaks the names of Herschel, Hewell, Wheatstone, Murchison, and Melbourne. He was unable, however, on account of the ever-increasing quantity of ice about the coast, to make out the details of its outlines. On the 23rd of January, the 74th degree, the most southerly latitude ever reached, was passed. The vessels were now considerably hampered by fogs, southerly gales, and violent snowstorms, but they managed to continue their cruise along the coast, and on the 27th of January the English disembarked on a little volcanic island in southern latitude 76 degrees 8 minutes and eastern longitude 168 degrees 12 minutes, to which they gave the name of Franklin. The next day a huge mountain was seen, which rose abruptly to a height of 12,000 feet above a far-stretching land. The summit, of regular form and completely covered with snow, was every now and then wrapped in a thick cloud of smoke, no less than 300 feet in diameter. Taking this diameter as a standard of measure, the height of the cloud, in shape like an inverted cone, would be about one half of it. When this cloud of smoke dispersed, a bare crater was discovered, lit up by a bright red glow, visible even in broad daylight. The sides of the mountain were covered with snow up to the very crater, and it was impossible to make out any signs of a flow of lava. A volcano is always a magnificent spectacle, and the sight of this one rising up from amongst the Antarctic ice, and excelling Etna and Teneriffe in its marvellous activity, could not fail to make a vivid impression upon the minds of the explorers. The name of Erebus was given to it, and that of Terror to an extinct crater on the east of it, both titles being admirably appropriate. The two vessels continued their cruise along the northern coast of Victoria, until their further passage was barred by a huge mass of ice towering 505 feet above their masts. Behind this barrier rose another mountain chain, which sank out of sight in the south-southeast, and to which the name of Parry was given. Ross skirted along the ice barrier in an easterly direction, until the 2nd February, when he reached southern latitude 78 degrees 4 minutes, the most southerly point attained on this trip, during which he had followed the shores of the land he had discovered for more than 300 miles. He left it in easterly longitude 191 degrees 23 minutes. But for the strong favourable winds which now blew, it seems probable that the vessel would never have issued in safety from amongst the formidable ice masses through which they finally worked their way at the cost of incredible exertions and fatigues, and in face of incessant danger. On the 15th of February yet another attempt was made in southern latitude 76 degrees to reach the magnetic pole, but further progress was barred by land in southern latitude 76 degrees 12 minutes and eastern longitude 164 degrees, that is 65 ordinary miles from the position assigned to it, the magnetic pole, by Ross, and the appearance of this land was forbidding, and the sea so rough that the explorer gave up all idea of continuing his research on shore. After identifying the islands discovered in 1839 by Balleny, Ross found himself on the 6th of March amongst the mountains alluded to by Wilkes. On the 4th of March, says Ross's narrative, they recrossed the Antarctic Circle, and being necessarily close by the eastern extreme of those patches of land, which Lieutenant Wilkes has called the Antarctic continent, and having reached the latitude on the 5th, they steered directly for them. And at noon of the 6th, the ship being exactly over the center of this mountain range, they could obtain no soundings with 600 fathoms of line. And having traversed a space of 80 miles in every direction from this spot, during beautiful clear weather which extended their vision widely around, were obliged to confess that this position at least of the pseudo-Antarctic continent, and the nearly 200 miles of barrier represented to extend from it, have no real existence. The expedition got back to Tasmania without having a single case of sickness on board or sustaining the slightest damage. The vessels were here refitted, and the instruments regulated before starting on a second trip, on which Sydney and Islands Bay, New Zealand, and Chatham were the first stations touched at by Ross to make magnetic observations. On the 18th of December, in southern latitude 62 degrees 40 minutes and eastern longitude 146 minutes, ice was encountered 300 miles further north than in the preceding year. The vessels had arrived too early, but Ross nevertheless endeavored to break through this formidable barrier. After penetrating for 300 miles, he was stopped by masses so compact that it was impossible to go further, and he did not cross the Antarctic Circle until the 1st of January 1842. On the 19th of the same month, the two vessels encountered the most violent storms just as they were entering an open sea. The Erebus and Terror lost their helms, floating ice washed over them, and for 26 hours they were in danger of going down. The detention of the expedition amongst the ice lasted no less than 46 days, and not until the 22nd did Ross reach the Great Barrier of stationary ice, which was considerably lower beyond Erebus, where it was no less than 200 feet high. When Ross came to it this year, it was only 107 feet high, and it was 150 miles further east than it had been on the previous expedition. The acquisition of this piece of geographical information was the only result of this arduous campaign, extending over 136 days, and greatly excelling in dramatic interest the preceding expedition. The vessels now made for Cape Horn, and sailed up the coast as far as Rio de Janeiro, where they found everything of which they stood in need. As soon as they had laid in a stock of provisions, they again put to sea, and reached the Falkland Islands, whence on the 17th of December 1842 they started on their third trip. The first ice was this time met with near Clarence Island, and on the 27th of December Ross found his further progress barred by it. He then made for the New Shetland Islands, completed the survey of Louis Philippe and Joinville lands discovered by Dumont d'Urville, named Mounts Haddington and Perry, ascertained that Louis Philippe's land is only a large island, and visited Bransfield Strait, separating it from Shetland. Such were the marvellous results obtained by James Ross in his 3 expeditions. To assign to the 3 explorers, whose work in the Antarctic regions we have been reviewing, his just meed of praise, we may say that d'Urville first discovered the Antarctic continent, Wilkes traced its shores for a considerable distance, for we cannot fail to recognize the resemblance between his map and that of the French navigator, and that James Ross visited the most southerly and most interesting part. But is there such a continent after all? D'Urville was not quite sure about it, and Ross did not believe in it. We must leave the decision of this great question to the later explorers, who were to follow in the footsteps of the intrepid sailors whose voyages and discoveries we have related. End of section 39. Section 40 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Piotr. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 3. The Great Explorers and Travelers of the 19th Century, by Jules Verne. Second part, Chapter 3, Part 2. The North Pole, 1. Anjou and Wrangel, Połynia, John Ross's first expedition, Baffin's Bay closed, Edward Parry's discoveries on his first voyage, the survey of Hudson's Bay and the discovery of Fury and Hecla Straits, Parry's third voyage. Fourth voyage. On the ice in sledges in the open sea. Franklin's first trip. Incredible sufferings of the explorers. Second expedition. John Ross. 4 winters amongst the ice. Dease and Simpson's expedition. We have more than once alluded to the great impulse given to geographical science by Peter I. One of the earliest results of this impulse was the discovery by Bering of the straits separating Asia from America, and the most important was the survey 30 years later of the Liakhov archipelago or New Siberia. In 1770 a merchant named Liakhov noticed a large herd of reindeer coming across the ice from the north, and he reflected that they could only come from a country where there were pastures enough to support them. A month later he started in a sledge, and after a journey of 50 miles he discovered between the mouths of the Lena and Indigirka 3 large islands, the vast deposits of fossil ivory which have since become celebrated all over the world. In 1809 Hedenström received instructions to make a map of this new discovery. He made several attempts to cross the frozen ocean on a sledge, but was always turned back by ice, which would not bear him. He came to the conclusion that there must be an open sea beyond, and he founded this opinion on the immense quantity of warm water which flows into the Arctic Ocean from the great rivers of Asia. In March 1821 Lieutenant, afterwards Admiral, Anjou crossed the ice to within 42 miles of the north of the island of Kotelnoi, and in the northern latitude 76 degrees 38 minutes saw a vapor which led him to believe in the existence of an open sea. In a second trip he actually saw this sea with its drifting ice, and came back convinced of the impossibility of going further in a sledge on account of the thinness of the ice. Whilst Anjou was thus employed, another naval officer, Lieutenant Wrangel, collected some important traditions about the existence of land the other side of Cape Yakan. From a Chukchi chief he learned that in fine weather, though never in the winter, from the coast and some reefs at the mouth of a river, mountains covered with snow could be seen far away in the north, and that in former days, when the sea was frozen over, reindeer used to come from there. The chief had himself once seen a herd of reindeer on their way back to the north by this route, and he had followed them in a sledge for a whole day, until the state of the ice compelled him to give up the experiment. His father had told him, too, that a Chukchi had once gone there with a few companions in a skin boat, but he did not know what they had discovered or what had become of them. He was sure that the land in the north was inhabited, because a dead whale had once been washed on to the Aratane Island, with spears tipped with slate in its flesh, and the Chukchis never used such weapons. These facts were very curious, and they increased Wrangel's desire to penetrate to the unknown northern districts. But the truth of all the rumours was not verified until our own day. Between 1820 and 1824 Wrangel made 4 expeditions in sledges from the mouth of the Kolyma, which he made his headquarters, first exploring the coast to Cape Chelagskoy and enduring 35 degrees of cold, and in his second trip trying how far he could go across the ice, an experiment resulting in a journey of 400 miles from land. In the third year, 1822, Wrangel started in March with a view to verifying the report of a native who said he had seen land in the offing. He now came to an ice field, on which he advanced safely for a long distance, when it began to be less compact, and was soon not solid enough to bear many sledges, so 2 small ones were selected, on which were packed a wherry, some planks, and some tools. The explorer then ventured on some melting ice, which broke under his feet. At the outset, says Wrangel, I had to make way for 7 wersts across a bed of brine. Further on appeared a surface furrowed with great crevasses, which we could only succeed in clearing by the help of our planks. I noticed in this part several small mounds of ice, in such a liquefying condition that the slightest touch would suffice to break it and convert the mound into a round slough. The ice upon which we were travelling was without consistency, was but a foot in thickness, and, what was more, was riddled with holes. I could only compare the appearance of the sea, at this stage, to an immense morass, and indeed the muddy water which issued from these thousands of crevasses, opening up in every direction, the melting snow mixed with earth and sand, Those little mounds whence numerous streamlets were issuing, all these combined to make the illusion perfect. Wrangel had advanced some 140 miles, and it was the open sea or the Połynia, as he calls vast expanses of water north of Siberia, the outskirts of which he had reached, the same in fact as that already cited by Leontiev in 1764 and Hedenström in 1810. On his fourth voyage Wrangel and his small party of followers started from Cape Yakan, the nearest point to the Arctic regions, and after passing Cape Chelagskoy made for the north. But a violent storm broke up the ice, there only 3 feet thick, and involved the explorers in the greatest danger. Now dragged across some large unbroken slab, now wet to the waist on a moving plank, sometimes above and sometimes under water, or moored to a block serving as a ferry boat, which the swimming dogs dragged along, they at last succeeded in crossing the shifting reverberating ice and regaining the land, owing their life to the strength and agility to their teams of dogs alone. Thus closed the last attempt made to reach the districts north of Siberia. The Arctic calotte was meanwhile being attacked from the other side with equal energy and yet more perseverance. It will be remembered with what untiring enthusiasm the famous Northwest Passage had been sought. No sooner had the peace of 1815 necessitated the disarmament of numerous English vessels, and set free their officers on half pay, than the Admiralty, unwilling to let experienced seamen rust in idleness, sought for them some employment. It was under these circumstances that the search for the Northwest Passage was resumed. The Alexander, 252 tons, and the Isabel, 385, under command of the experienced officers, John Ross and Lieutenant Parry, with James Ross, Back, and Belcher, who were to win honours in Arctic exploration amongst their subordinates, were sent by the government to explore Baffin's Bay, and set sail on the 18th of April. After touching at the Shetland Islands, and seeking in vain for the submerged land seen by Bass in northern latitude 57 degrees 28 minutes, the explorers came on the 26th of May to the first ice, and on the 2nd of June surveyed the western coast of Greenland, hitherto very imperfectly laid down in maps, finding it greatly encumbered in ice. Indeed, the governor of the Dutch settlement of Whale Island told them that the severity of the winter months had been steadily increasing during the 11 years of his residence in the country. Hitherto it had been supposed that the country was uninhabited beyond 75 degrees northern latitude, and the travellers were therefore greatly surprised to see a whole tribe of Esquimaux arriving by way of the ice. They knew nothing of any race but their own, and stared at the English without daring to touch them, one of them even addressing to the vessels in a grave and solemn voice the inquiries, "Who are you? Whence do you come? From the sun or from the moon?" Although in many respects far inferior to the Esquimaux, who had been to some extent civilized by long intercourse with Europeans, the newcomers understood the use of iron, of which a few of them had even succeeded in making knives. This iron, as far as the English could gather, was dug out of a mountain. It was probably of meteoric origin. As public opinion in England subsequently confirmed, Ross, in spite of qualities as a naval officer of the highest order, showed extraordinary apathy and levity on this voyage, appearing not to trouble himself in the least about the geographical problems for the solution of which the expedition was organized. He passed Wolstenholme and Whale Sounds, and Smith's Strait, opening out of Baffin's Bay, without examining them, the last named at so great a distance that he did not even recognize it. Still worse than that was his conduct later. Cruising down the western shores of Baffin's Bay, a long deep gulf no less than 50 miles across gradually came in sight of the eager explorers. Yet when on the 29th of August the two vessels had sailed up it for 30 miles only, Ross gave orders to tack about, on the ground that he distinctly saw at the further end a chain of lofty mountains, to which he gave the name of Crocker. His officers did not share his opinion. They could not see so much as the slightest sign of a hill, for the very excellent reason that the gulf they had entered was really Lancaster Sound, so named by Baffin, and connecting his bay with the western Arctic Ocean. The same sort of thing occurred again and again in this voyage along this deeply indented coast, the vessels keeping so far off shore that not a detail could be made out. Thus it came about that Cumberland Bay was passed on the 1st of October, without any survey of that most important feature of Davis Strait, and Ross returned to England, having literally turned his back on the glory awaiting him. When accused of apathy and neglect of duty, Ross replied with supreme indifference: "I trust, as I believe myself, that the objects of the voyage have been in every important point accomplished, that I have proved the existence of a bay from Disco to Cumberland Strait, and set at rest for ever the question of a north-west passage in this direction." It would have been impossible to make a more complete mistake. But fortunately the failure of this expedition did not in the least discourage other explorers. Some saw in it a brilliant confirmation of the venerable Baffin's discovery. Others looked upon the innumerable inlets, with their deep waters and strong currents, as something more than mere bays. They were straits, and all hope of the discovery of the north-west passage was not yet lost. These suggestions so far weighted with the English Admiralty as to lead to the equipment of two small vessels, the bomb vessel Hecla and the brigantine Griper, which left the Thames on the 5th of May, 1819, under command of Lieutenant William Parry, whose opinion as to the existence of the north-west passage had not coincided with that of his chief. The vessels reached Lancaster Sound without meeting with any special adventures, and after a delay of 7 days amongst the ice, which encumbered the sea at the distance of 80 miles, they entered the supposed bay, shut in by a mountain chain of John Ross, to find not only that this mountain chain did not exist, but that the bay was a strait more than 310 fathoms deep, where the influence of the tide could be felt. The temperature of the water rose some 10 degrees, and in the course of a single day no less than 80 full-grown whales were seen. On the 31st of July the explorers landed on the shores of Possession Bay, visited by them the previous year, and found there their own footprints, a sign of the small quantity of snow and hoar-frost which had fallen during the winter. All hearts beat high when with a favourable wind, and all sails set, the two vessels entered Lancaster Sound. It is more easy, says Parry, to imagine than to describe the almost breathless anxiety which was now visible in every countenance, while, as the breeze continued to a fresh gale, we ran quickly up the Sound. The mastheads were crowded by the officers and men during the whole afternoon, and an unconcerned observer, if any could be unconcerned on such an occasion, would have been amused by the eagerness with which the various reports from the Crow's Nest were received. The two coasts extended in a parallel line as far as the eye could reach, that is to say for a distance exceeding 50 miles, and the height of the waves together with the absence of ice combined to convince the English that they had reached the open sea by way of the long sought passage, when an island framed in masses of ice checked their further progress. An arm of the sea, however, some 12 leagues wide, opened on the south, and by it the explorers hoped to find a passage less encumbered by ice. Strange to say, as they had advanced in a westerly direction through Lancaster Sound, the vibrations of the pendulum had increased, whilst now it appeared to have lost all motion, and we now therefore witnessed for the first time the curious phenomenon of the directive power of the needle becoming so weak as to be completely overcome by the attraction of the ship, so that the needle might now be properly said to point to the North Pole of the ship. The arm of the sea widened as the vessels advanced in a westerly direction, and the shores seemed to bend sensibly towards the southwest, but after making some 120 miles, further progress was again barred by ice. The explorers therefore returned to Barrow's Strait, of which Lancaster Sound is but the entry, and once more entered the sea, now free from the ice, by which it had been encumbered a few days previously. In western longitude 92 degrees 1 minute and 4 seconds was discovered an inlet called Wellington Channel, about 8 leagues wide, entirely free from ice, and apparently not bounded by any land. The existence of these numerous straits led the explorers to the conclusion that they were in the midst of a vast archipelago, an opinion daily receiving fresh confirmation. The dense fogs, however, made navigation difficult, and the number of little islands and shallows increased whilst the ice became more compact. Parry, however, was not to be deterred from pressing on towards the west, and presently his sailors found, on a large island, to which the name of Bathurst was given, the remains of some Eskimo huts and traces of the former presence of reindeer. Magnetic observations were now taken, pointing to the conclusion that the magnetic pole had been passed on the north. Another large island, that of Melville, soon came in sight, and in spite of the fogs and ice the expedition succeeded in passing western longitude 110 degrees, thus earning the reward of £100 sterling promised by the English government. A promontory near Melville Island was named Cape Munificence, whilst a good harbour close by was called Hecla and Griper Bay. It was in Winter Harbour at the end of this bay that the vessels passed the winter. Dismantled for the most part, says Parry, the yards however being laid for walls, and roofed in with thick wading tilts, they were sheltered from the snow, whilst stoves and ovens were fixed inside. Hunting was useless, and resulted in nothing but the frost biting of the limbs of some of the hunters, as Melville Island was deserted at the end of October by all animals except wolves and foxes. To get through the long winter without dying of ennui was no easy matter, but the officers hit upon the plan of setting up a theatre, the first representation in which was given on the 6th of November, the day of the disappearance of the sun for 3 months. A special piece was given on Christmas Day, in which allusion was made to the situation of the vessel, and a weekly paper was started called the North Georgia Gazette and Winter Chronicle, which, with Sabine as editor, ran into 21 numbers, all printed on the return to Europe of the expedition. In January scrofula broke out, and with such virulence as to cause considerable alarm, but the evil was soon checked by skilful treatment and the daily distribution of mustard and cress, which Parry had managed to grow in boxes round his stove. End of section 40. Section 41 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Piotr. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 3. The Great Explorers and Travelers of the 19th Century, by Jules Verne. Second part, Chapter 3, Part 2, The North Pole, 2. On the 7th of February the sun reappeared, and although many months must elapse before it would be possible to leave Melville Island, preparations for a start were at once begun. On the 30th of April the thermometer rose to 0, and the sailors, taking this low temperature for summer, wanted to leave off their winter clothes. The first ptarmigan appeared on the 12th of May, and on the following day were seen traces of reindeer and of musk goats on their way to the north. But what caused the greatest delight and surprise to the crews was the fall of rain on the 24th of May. We had been so unaccustomed to see water naturally in a fluid state at all, and much less to see it fall from the heavens, that such an occurrence became a matter of considerable curiosity, and I believe every person on board hastened on deck to witness so interesting as well as novel a phenomenon. During the first fortnight in June, Parry, accompanied by some of his officers, made an excursion to the most northerly part of Melville Island. On his return, vegetation was everywhere to be seen. The ice was beginning to melt, and it was evident that a start could soon be made. The vessels began to move on the 1st of August, but the ice had not yet broken up in the offing, and they got no further than the eastern extremity of Melville Island, of which the furthest point reached by Parry was in northern latitude 113 degrees 46 minutes 13 seconds, and western longitude 113 degrees 46 minutes 33 seconds. The voyage back was unmarked by any special incident, and the expedition got back to England towards the middle of November. The results of this voyage were numerous and important. Not only had a vast extent of the Arctic regions been surveyed, but physical and magnetic observations had been taken, and many new details collected on their climate and animal and vegetable life. In fact, in a single trip, Parry did more than was accomplished in 30 years by all who followed in his steps. Satisfied with the important results obtained by him, the Admiralty appointed Parry to the command in 1821 to the Hecla and the Fury, the latter built on the model of the former. On this new trip the explorer surveyed with the greatest care the shores of Hudson's Bay and the coast of the peninsula of Melville, not to be confounded with the island of the same name. The winter was passed on Winter Island, on the eastern coast of this peninsula, and the same amusements were resorted to which had succeeded so well on the previous expedition, supplemented most effectively by the arrival on the 1st of February of a party of Esquimaux from across the ice. Their huts, which had not been discovered by the English, were built on the beach, and numerous visits paid to them during the 18 months passed on Winter Island gave a better notion than had ever been obtained of the manners, customs, characters, etc. of this singular people. The thorough survey of the Straits of Fury and Hecla, separating the peninsula of Melville from Cockburn Island, involved the passing of a second winter in the Arctic regions, and though the quarters were now more comfortable, time dragged heavily, for the officers and men were dreadfully disappointed at having to turn back just as they had thought to start for Behring's Strait. On the 12th of August the ice broke up, and Parry wanted to send his men to Europe, and himself complete by land the exploration of the districts he had discovered. But Captain Lyon dissuaded him from a plan so desperate. The vessels therefore returned to England with all hands, after an absence of 27 months, having lost but 5 men, although 2 consecutive winters had been spent in the Arctic regions. Although the results of the second voyage were not equal to those of the first, some of them were beyond price. It was now known that the American coast did not extend beyond the 70° northern latitude, and that the Atlantic was connected with the Arctic Ocean by an immense number of straits and channels, most of them, the Fury, Hecla, and Fox for instance, obstructed with ice brought down by the currents. Whilst the ice barrier on the southeast of Melville Peninsula appeared permanent, that at Regent's Inlet was evidently the reverse. It might therefore be possible to penetrate through it to the polar basin, and it was with this end in view that the Fury and Hecla were once more equipped and placed under the orders of Parry. This voyage was the least fortunate of any undertaken by this skilful seaman, not on account of any failing off in his work, but because he was the victim of unlucky accidents and unfavourable circumstances. Meeting, for instance, with an unusual quantity of ice in Baffin's Bay, he had the greatest trouble to reach Prince Regent's Inlet. Had he arrived 3 weeks earlier, he would probably have been able to land on the American coast, but as it was, he was obliged to make immediate preparations for going into winter quarters. It was no very formidable matter to this experienced officer to spend a winter under the polar circle. He knew what precautions to take to preserve the health of his crews, to keep himself well, and what companions and amusements would best relieve the tedium of a 3 months' night. Races between the officers, masquerades, and theatrical entertainments, with the temperature maintained at 50° Fahrenheit, kept all the men healthy and happy until the thaw, which set in on the 20th of July, 1822, enabled Parry to resume exploring operations. He now skirted along the eastern coast of Prince Regent's Inlet, but the floating ice gathered about the vessels and drove them on shore. The Fury was so much damaged that though 4 pumps were constantly at work, she could hardly be kept afloat, and Parry was trying to get her repaired under shelter of a huge block of ice, when a tempest came on, broke in pieces the extemporary dock, and flung the vessel again upon the shore, where she had to be abandoned. Her crew were received on the Hecla, which, after such an accident as this, was of course obliged to return to England. Parry's tempered spirit was not broken even by this last disaster. If the Arctic Ocean could not be reached from Baffin's Bay, were there not other routes still to be attempted? The vast tract of ocean between Greenland and Spitzbergen, for instance, might turn out less dangerous, freer as it of necessity would be from the huge icebergs which gather about the Arctic coasts. The earliest expeditions in these latitudes of which we have any record are those of Scoresby, who long cruised about them in search of whales. In 1806 he penetrated in eastern longitude 16°, reckoning from Paris, beyond Spitzbergen, that is, to northern latitude 81° 30', where he saw ice stretching away in the east-northeast. whilst between that and the south-east the sea was open for a distance of 30 miles. There was no land within 100 miles. It seems a matter of regret that the whaler did not take advantage of the favourable state of the sea to have advanced yet further north, when he might have made some important discovery, perhaps even have reached the Pole itself. Parry now resolved to do what the exigencies of his profession had rendered impossible to Scoresby, and leaving London on the Hecla on the 27th of March, 1827, he reached Lapland in safety, and having at Hammerfest embarked dogs, reindeer, and canoes, he proceeded on his way to Spitzbergen. Port Swedenburg, where he wished to touch, was still shut in with ice, and against this barrier the Hecla struggled until the 24th of May, when Parry left her in Hinlopen Strait and advanced northwards with Ross, Crozier, a dozen men, and provisions for 72 days in a couple of canoes. After leaving a depot of provisions at Seven Islands, he packed his food and boats on sledges specially constructed for the occasion, hoping to cross in them the barrier of solid ice, and to find beyond a navigable, if not an entirely open sea. The ice did not, however, as Parry expected, turn out to form a homogeneous mass. There were here and there vast gaps to be forded, or steep hills to be climbed, and in 4 days the explorers only advanced about 8 miles in a northerly direction. On the 2nd of July, in a dense fog, the thermometer marked 1° 9' above zero in the shade, and 8° 3' in the sun. And as may be imagined, the march across the broken surface, gaping everywhere with fissures, was terribly arduous, whilst the difficulties were aggravated by the continual glare from the snow and ice. In spite, however, of all obstacles, the party pressed bravely on, and on the 20th of July found they had got no further than northern latitude 82° 37', that is, only about 5 miles beyond the point reached 3 days previously. Now, as they had undoubtedly made at least about 14 miles in the interval, it was evident that the ice on which they were was being drifted southwards by a strong current. Parry at first concealed this most discouraging fact from his men, but it soon became evident to everyone that no progress was being made but the slight difference between their own speed, as they struggled over the many obstacles in their path, and that of the current bearing the ice field in the opposite direction. Moreover, the expedition now came to a place where the half-broken ice was not fit to bear the weight of the men or of the sledges. It was, in fact, nothing more than an immense accumulation of blocks of ice, which, tossed about by the waves, made a deafening noise as they crashed against each other. Provisions, too, were running short. The men were discouraged, Ross was hurt, Parry was suffering from inflammation of the ice, and the wind had veered into a contrary direction, driving the explorers southwards. There was nothing for it but to turn back. This venturesome trip, throughout which the thermometer had not sunk between 2° 2', might have succeeded had it been undertaken a little earlier in the season, for then the explorers could have penetrated beyond 82° 4'. In any case they would certainly not have had to turn back on account of rain, snow, and damp, all signs of the summer thaw. When Parry got back to the Hecla, he found that she had been in the greatest danger. Driven before a violent gale, her chains had been broken by the ice, and she had been flung upon the beach and run aground. When got off, she had been taken to Waigat Strait. All dangers past, however, the explorers got back safely in the rescued vessel to the Orkneys, where they landed, and whence they returned to London, arriving there on the 30th of September. Whilst Parry was seeking a passage to the Pacific by way of Baffin's or Hudson's Bay, several expeditions were organized to complete the discoveries of Mackenzie and survey the North American coast. These expeditions were not fraught with any great danger, and the results might be of the most vital importance alike to geographical and nautical science. The command of the first was entrusted to Franklin, afterwards so justly celebrated, with whom were associated Dr. Richardson, George Back, then a midshipman in the Royal Navy, and 2 common seamen. The explorers arrived on the 30th of August at York Factory, on the shores of Hudson's Bay, and having obtained from the fur hunters all the information necessary to their success, they started again on the 9th of September, reaching Cumberland House, 690 miles further, on the 22nd of October. The season was now nearly at an end, but Franklin and Back nevertheless succeeded in penetrating to Fort Chippeway, on the western side of Lake Athabasca, where they proposed making preparations for the expedition of the ensuing summer. This trip of 857 miles was accomplished in the depth of winter, with the thermometer at between 40 and 50 degrees below zero. Early in spring, Dr. Richardson joined the rest of the party at Fort Chippeway, and all started together on the 18th of July, 1820, in the hope of reaching comfortable quarters at the mouth of the copper mine, before the bad season set in. Franklin and his people did not, however, make sufficient allowance for the difficulties of the route or for the obstacles resulting from the severity of the winter, and it took them till the 20th of August to cross the waterfalls, shallows, lakes, rivers, and portages which impeded their progress. Game, too, was scarce. At the first appearance of ice on the ponds, the Canadian guides began to complain, and when flocks of wild geese were seen flying southwards, they refused to go any further. Annoyed as he was at this absence of goodwill in the people in his service, Franklin was compelled to give up his schemes, and when 550 miles from Fort Chippeway, in northern latitude 64 degrees 28 minutes, western longitude 118 degrees 6 minutes, he built on the banks of Winter River a wooden house, which he called Fort Enterprise. Here the explorers collected as much food as they could, manufacturing with reindeer flesh what is known throughout North America as pemmican. At first the number of reindeer seen was considerable. No less than 2,000 were once sighted in a single day, but this was only a proof that they were migrating to more clement latitudes. The pemmican prepared from 80 reindeer and the fish obtained in Winter River both ran short before the expedition was able to proceed. Whole tribes of Indians, on hearing of the arrival of the whites, collected about the camp, greatly harassing the explorers by their begging, and soon exhausted the supply of blankets, tobacco, etc., which had been brought as means of barter. Disappointed at the non-arrival of reinforcements with provisions, Franklin sent Back with an escort of Canadians to Fort Chippeway on the 18th of October. "I had the pleasure," says Back, writing after his return, "of meeting my friends, all in good health, after an absence of nearly 5 months, during which I travelled 1,104 miles in snowshoes, and had no other covering at night in the woods than a blanket and deerskin, with the thermometer frequently at 40 degrees, and once at 57 degrees below zero, and sometimes passing 2 or 3 days without tasting food." Those who remained at the fort also suffered terribly from cold, the thermometer sinking 3 degrees lower than it had done when Parry was at Melville Island, 9 degrees nearer the pole. Not only did the men suffer from the extreme severity of the cold, but the trees were frozen to the pith, and axes broke against them without making so much as a notch. 2 interpreters from Hudson's Bay had accompanied Back to Fort Enterprise, one of whom had a daughter said to be the loveliest creature ever seen, and who, though only 16, had already been married twice. One of the English officers took her portrait, to the terrible distress of her mother, who feared that if the great chief of England saw the inanimate representation, he would fall in love with the original. On the 14th of June the Coppermine River was sufficiently free from ice to be navigable, and although their provisions were all but exhausted, the explorers embarked upon it. As it fortunately turned out, however, game was very plentiful on the green banks of the river, and enough musk oxen were killed to feed the whole party. The mouth of the Coppermine was reached on the 18th of July, when the Indians, afraid of meeting their enemies the Eskimo, at once returned to Fort Enterprise, whilst the Canadians scarcely dared to launch their frail boats on the angry sea. Franklin at last succeeded in persuading them to run the risk, but he could not get them to go further than Cape Turn again, in northern latitude 68 degrees 30 minutes, a promontory at the opening of a deep gulf dotted with islands, to which the leader of the expedition gave the name of Coronation, in memory of the accession of George IV. Franklin had begun to ascend Hood River, when he was stopped by a cataract 150 feet high, compelling him to make his way overland across a barren, unknown district. and through snow more than 2 feet deep. The fatigue and suffering involved in this return journey can be more easily imagined than described. Suffice it to say that the party arrived on the 11th of October in a state of complete exhaustion, having eaten nothing for 5 days at Fort Enterprise, which they found utterly deserted. Ill and without food, there seemed to be nothing left for Franklin to do but to die. The next day, however, he set to work to look for the Indians, and those of his party who had started before him. But the snow was so thick he had to return without accomplishing anything. For the next 18 days life was supported by a kind of bouilli made from the bones and the skin of the game killed the previous year, and at last, on the 29th of October, Dr. Richardson arrived with John Hepburn, only looking thin and worn, and scarcely being able to speak above a whisper. It seemed as if they were doomed. We quote the following from Desborough Cooley. Dr. Richardson had now a melancholy tale to relate. For the first 2 days his party had nothing whatever to eat. On the third day Michele arrived with a hare and partridge, which afforded each a small morsel. Then another day passed without food. On the 11th Michele offered them some flesh, which he said was part of a wolf, but they afterwards became convinced that it was the flesh of one of the unfortunate men who had left Captain Franklin's party to return to Dr. Richardson. Michele was daily growing more insolent and shy, and it was strongly suspected that he had a hidden supply of meat for his own use. On the 20th, while Hepburn was cutting wood near the tent, he heard the report of a gun, and looking towards the spot, saw Michele dart into the tent. Mr. Hood was found dead. A ball had entered the back part of his head, and there could be no doubt but that Michele was the murderer. He now became more mistrustful and outrageous than before, and as his strength was superior to that of the English who survived, and he was well armed, they became satisfied that there was no safety for them but in his death. I determined, says Dr. Richardson, as I was thoroughly convinced of the necessity of such a dreadful act, to take the whole responsibility upon myself, and upon Michele coming up, I put an end to his life by shooting him through the head. Many of the Indians who had accompanied Richardson and Hepburn had died of hunger, and the 2 leaders were on the brink of the grave when, on the 7th of November, 3 Indians sent by Back brought them help. As soon as they felt a little stronger, the 2 Englishmen made for the company's settlement, where they found Back, to whom they had twice owed their lives on this one expedition. The results of this journey, in which 5,500 miles had been traversed, were of the greatest importance to geographical, magnetic, and meteorological science, and the coast of America had now been surveyed as far as Cape Turn again. End of section 41. Section 42 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Piotr. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 3. The Great Explorers and Travelers of the 19th Century, by Jules Verne. Second part, Chapter 3, Part 2. The North Pole, 3. In spite of all the fatigue and suffering so bravely borne, the explorers were quite ready to make yet another attempt to reach the shores of the Polar Sea, and at the end of 1823 Franklin received instructions to survey the coast west of Mackenzie River, all the agents of the company being ordered to supply his party with provisions, boats, guides, and everything else they might require. After a hearty reception at New York, Franklin went to Albany by way of the Hudson, ascended the Niagara from Lewiston to the famous falls, made his way thence to Fort St. George on the Ontario, crossed the lake, landed at York, the capital of Upper Canada, passed Lakes Siamese, Huron, and Superior, where he was joined by 24 Canadians, and on the 29th of June 1825 came to Lake Mete, then alive with boats. Whilst Dr. Richardson was surveying the eastern coast of Great Bear Lake, and Back was superintending the preparations for the winter, Franklin reached the mouth of the Mackenzie, the navigation of which was very easy, no obstacles being met with except in the delta. The sea was free from ice, and black and white whales and seals were playing about at the top of the water. Franklin landed on the small island of Garry, the position of which he determined as northern latitude 69 degrees 2 minutes, western longitude 135 degrees 41 minutes. A valuable fact, proving as it did how much confidence was to be placed in the observations of Mackenzie. The return journey was made without difficulty, and on the 5th of September the explorers arrived at the fort to which Dr. Richardson had given the name of Franklin. The winter was passed in festivities, such as balls, etc., in which Canadians, English, Scotch, French, Eskimo, and Indians of various tribes took part. On the 22nd of June a fresh start was made, and on the 4th of July the fort was reached, where the Mackenzie divides into two branches. There the expedition separated into two parties, one going to the east and the other to the west, to explore the shores of the Arctic Ocean. Franklin and his companions had hardly left the river when he met near a large bay of numerous party of Eskimo, who at first testified great delight at the rencontre, but soon became obstreperous and tried to carry off the boat. Only by the exercise of wonderful patience and tact were the English able to avert bloodshed on this emergency. Franklin now surveyed and gave name of Clarence to the river separating the English from the Russian territories, and a little further on was discovered another stream, which he called the Canning. On the 16th of April, finding he had only made half of the distance between Mackenzie River and Icy Cape, though the winter was rapidly approaching, Franklin turned back and embarked on the beautiful Peel River, which he mistook for that of Mackenzie, not discovering his error till he came in sight of a chain of mountains on the east. On the 21st of September he got back to the fort, after having in the course of 3 months traversed 2,048 miles and surveyed 372 miles of the American coast. Richardson meanwhile had advanced into much deeper water with far less floating ice, and had met with a great many Eskimo of mild and hospitable manners. He surveyed Liverpool and Franklin Bays, and discovered opposite the mouth of the Coppermine a tract of land separated from the continent by a channel not more than 20 miles wide, to which he gave the name of Wollaston. His boats arrived at Coronation Gulf, explored on the previous trip on the 7th of August, and on the 1st of September they got back to Fort Franklin without having sustained any damage. In dwelling on Parry's voyages, we have, for the time, turned aside from those made at the same time by Ross, whose extraordinary exploration of Baffin's Bay had brought upon him the censure of the Admiralty, and who was anxious to regain his reputation for skill and courage. Though the government had lost confidence in him, he won the esteem of a rich ship owner, who did not hesitate to entrust to him the command of steamship Victory, on which he started for Baffin's Bay on the 25th of May 1830. For 4 years nothing was heard of the courageous navigator, but on his return, at the end of that time, it turned out that his voyage had been as rich in discoveries as had been Parry's first trip. Ross, entering Prince Regent's Inlet by way of Barrow and Lancaster Sounds, had revisited the spot where the Fury had been abandoned 4 years previously, and continuing his voyage in a southerly direction, he wintered in Felix Harbour, so named after the equipper of the expedition, ascertaining, whilst there, that the lands he had passed formed a large peninsula, attached on the south to the northern coast of America. In April 1830, James Ross, nephew of the leader of the party, set out in a canoe to examine the shores of this peninsula and those of King William's Land, and in November of the same year all had once more to go into winter quarters in Sheriff's Harbour, it being impossible to get the vessel more than a few miles further north. The cold was intense, and it was agreed by the sailors of the Victory that this was the very severest winter ever spent by them in the Arctic regions. The summer of 1831 was devoted to various surveys, which proved that there was no connection between the two seas. All that was accomplished this season was to bring the Victory as far as Discovery Harbour, a very little further north than that of Sheriff. The ensuing winter was so intensely severe that the vessel could not be extricated from her ice prison, and but for the fortunate discovery of the provisions left by the Fury, the English would have died of hunger. As it was, they endured daily greater and greater privations and sufferings before the summer of 1833 at last enabled them finally to leave their winter quarters and go by land to Prince Regent's and Barrow Straits. They had just reached the shores of Baffin's Bay when a vessel appeared, which turned out to be the Isabel, once commanded by Ross himself, and which now received the refugees from the Victory. But England had not all this time been forgetful of her children, and had sent an expedition in search of them every year. In 1833, Back, Franklin's companion, was the leader, and he, starting from Fort Revolution, on the shore of Slave Lake, made his way northward, discovered Tloni Cho Desert River, and settled down in winter quarters, with the intention of reaching the next year the Polar Sea, where he supposed Ross to be held prisoner, when he heard of his incredible return journey overland. Back therefore gave up the next season to the survey of the Fine Fish River, discovered the previous year, and sighted the Queen Adelaide Mountains, with Capes Booth and Ross. 1836 found him at the head of a new expedition, which was to attempt to connect by sea the discoveries of Ross and Franklin. It failed, and the accomplishment of this task assigned to it was reserved to Peter Williams, Dease, and Thomas Simpson, all officers in the service of the Hudson's Bay Company, who, leaving Fort Chippeway on the 1st of June, 1837, went down the Mackenzie, arriving on the sea coast on the 9th of July, and making their way along it to the northern latitude 71 degrees 3 minutes, and western longitude 156 degrees 46 minutes, that is, to a cape they named Simpson, after the governor of their company. Thomas Simpson now made his way overland with 5 men to Port Barrow, already sighted in the direction of Bering Strait by one of Beechey's officers, so that the whole of the North American coast, from Cape Turn again to Bering Strait, was now complete, and there was nothing left to do but to explore the space between the former and Point Ogle, a task accomplished by the explorers in a later expedition. Leaving the copper mine in 1839, they followed the eastern coast, arriving on the 9th of August at Cape Turn again, which was too much encumbered with ice to be rounded. Thomas Simpson therefore remained near it for the winter, discovered Victoria Land, and on the 12th of August 1839 arrived at Back River. The rest of the month he devoted to the exploration of Boothia. The whole of the coastline of North America was now accurately laid down, but at the cost of what struggles, devotion, privation, and sufferings! What, however, is human life when weighed in the balance with the progress of science? And with what disinterestedness and enthusiasm must be imbued the savants, sailors, and explorers who gave up all the joys of existence to contribute to the best of their power to the progress of knowledge, and to the moral and intellectual development of humanity. With the voyages last recorded, the discovery of the earth was completed, and with our account of them, our work, which began with the first attempts of the earliest explorers, also closes. The shape of the earth is now known, the task of explorers is done. The land on which man lives is henceforth familiar to him, and he has now only to turn to account the vast resources of the countries to which access has recently become easy, or of which he can without difficulty possess himself. How rich in lessons of every kind is this history of 20 centuries of exploration! Let us cast a glance behind us, and enumerate the main features of the progress made in this long series of years. If we take the map of the world of Hecatus, who lived 500 years before the Christian era, what do we see? When it was first published, the known world did not extend beyond the basin of the Mediterranean, and the whole, with a terribly distorted outline, is represented only by a very small portion of southern Europe, the interior of Asia, and part of North Africa, whilst encircling them all is a river without beginning or end, to which is given the name of ocean. Side by side with this map, ancient monument as it is of antique science, let us place a planisphere representing the world as known in 1840, and on this vast surface we shall find the portion known, and that but imperfectly, to Hecatus, occupying but an infinitesimal space. Taking these two typical maps as our starting point, we shall be able to judge of the magnitude of the discoveries of modern times. Imagine for a moment all that is involved in thorough knowledge of the whole world, and you will marvel at the results achieved by the efforts of so many explorers and martyrs. You will grasp the importance of their discoveries and the intimate relations between geography and the other sciences. This is the point of view from which can best be seen all the philosophic bearings of a work to which so many generations have devoted themselves. Doubtless the motives actuating these various explorers differ greatly. First, we have the natural curiosity of the owner, anxious to know thoroughly every part of the domain belonging to him, so that he may estimate the extent of the habitable districts, and determine the boundaries of the seas, etc. And secondly, we have the natural outcome of a trade, which, though still in its infancy, introduced even in remote Norway the products of Central Asian industry. In the time of Herodotus the aim of explorers was loftier. They wished to learn the history, manners, customs, and religion of foreign races, and later the Crusades, which, whatever else they accomplished, certainly vulgarized Oriental studies, inspired some few with a fervent desire to wrest from infidels the scene of our Lord's Passion, but the greater number with a lust of pillage and a yearning to explore the unknown. Columbus, seeking a new route to the Indies, came across America on the way, and his successors were only anxious to make rapid fortunes, differing greatly indeed from the noble Portuguese, who sacrificed their private interests to the glory and colonial prosperity of their country, and were the poorer for the offices conferred on them with a view to doing them honour. In the 16th century, religious persecution and civil war drove to the New World the Huguenots and Puritans, who, whilst laying for England the foundations of colonial prosperity, were to bring about a radical change in America. The next century was essentially one of colonization. In America the French, in India the English, and in Oceania the Dutch established counting houses and offices, whilst missionaries endeavoured to win over to the Christian faith and modern ideas the unchangeable empire of the mean. The 18th century, ushering in our own, rectified received errors, and surveyed minutely alike continents and archipelagos, in a word, brought to perfection the work of its predecessors. The same task has occupied modern explorers, who pride themselves on not passing over in their service the smallest corner of the earth or the tiniest islet. With a similar enthusiasm are imbued the intrepid navigators who penetrate the ice-bound solitudes of the two poles, and tear away the last fragments of the veil, which has so long hidden from us the extremities of the globe. All then is now known, classed, catalogued, and labelled. Will the results of so much toil be buried in some carefully laid down atlas, to be sought only by professional savants? No, it is reserved to our use, and to develop the resources of the globe, conquered for us by our fathers at the cost of so much danger and fatigue. Our heritage is too grand to be relinquished. We have at our command all the facilities of modern knowledge, for surveying, clearing, and working our property. No more lands lying fallow, no more impassable deserts, no more useless streams, no more unfathomable seas, no more inaccessible mountains. We suppress the obstacles nature throws in our way. The isthmuses of Panama and Suez are in our way, we cut through them. The Sahara interferes with the connection of Algeria and Senegal, we will throw a railway across it. The Pas de Calais prevents two nations, so well fitted for cordial friendship, from shaking each other by the hand, we will pierce it with a railway. This is our task and that of our contemporaries. Is it less grand than that of our predecessors, that it has not yet succeeded in inspiring any great writer of fiction? To dwell upon it ourselves would be to exceed the limits we laid down for our work. We meant to write the history of the discovery of the world, and we have written it. Our task, therefore, is complete. End of section 42. End of Celebrated Travels and Travellers, Volume 3, The Great Explorers and Travellers of the 19th Century, by Jules Verne, translated by N. Danvers.